Executive Director of the Open Markets Institute, and we are thrilled to have you all here today for this very important conversation and a path-breaking speech by Senator Klobuchar. Our democracy stands on a foundation of a free and independent press, not controlled by the state or any one or few private, powerful actors. The role of the free press in our democracy is no accident. We built it into our system by design. We see this most famously in the First Amendment. We see it also in the Postal Clause, which established the first means for distributing that news. In a 1945 case challenging the monopoly power of the Associated Press, Supreme Court Justice Hugo Black said, "A free press is a condition of a free society. Freedom of the press from governmental interference under the First Amendment does not sanction repression of that freedom by private interests." Justice Frankfurter, concurring, added, "The freedom of enterprise protected by the Sherman Law necessarily has different aspects in relation to the press than in the case of ordinary commercial pursuits. The press," Justice Frankfurter said, "enjoys a unique constitutional position." But he warned, freedom of the press may be defeated by private restraints no less than by public censorship. We are here today because our news media, our free press today faces a new set of threats greater perhaps than any in our history. The most immediate danger, the reason we are here today, is Facebook's threat to shut off the sharing of news in California, to stop the people of that state from forcing Facebook to pay journalists and publishers for the news it shares. Facebook is serious about this threat. The corporation has already deprived the citizens of Canada, one of our closest democratic allies, of this right. And Facebook has made similar threats in the UK and Australia. The larger threat we are here to discuss today is the generalized manipulation by the online communications platforms on which we depend of how we communicate with one another and share information with one another. The way Amazon manipulates book authors, publishers, readers, and the public. The way Elon Musk manipulates and censors debate on Twitter. The way Google has monopolized the advertising on which the free press depends. I stand here as a journalist. I've worked in newspapers, magazines, the wire services, and books. I've worked as a reporter, writer, editor, as part of a publishing team. That's why I can say with confidence that in our ever wider ranging war to protect democracy against monopoly, our single most important battle is here. If we lose our ability to communicate freely with one another, to report and share news freely with one another, to debate freely with one another, it's all over. That's why I'm so thrilled that we have Minister St-Onge, who's the Minister of Canadian Heritage, with us today to talk about what's going on in Canada. It's also why I'm so thrilled to have Senator Klobuchar with us again today, later in the morning. Senator Klobuchar, I'm going to say a couple words about her. Senator Klobuchar is, because I know her, I don't know the minister yet. Senator Klobuchar is fearless and unrelenting. She understands what is at stake. Here's a quote from the senator's recent book on antitrust. "Dominant digital platforms hold tremendous power over newspaper publishers, and they exercise near total control over news content that reaches readers." That's pretty good. We at Open Markets have helped lead this fight to protect the free press and free speech from the power and business models of these gatekeepers, these masters in the middle, since 2009. To focus our work, 4 years ago, we established the Center for Journalism and Liberty with very generous support from the Knight Foundation and others. Since then, we have built CJL into the leading nonprofit fighting to rebuild the sort of open market system and advertising that is essential to a free press. That's why I'm also so happy to now introduce Courtney Radich, who recently joined Open Markets as director of our Center for Journalism and Liberty. You can read the details of Courtney's stellar CV online, but the reason that I know that Courtney is the perfect person to help lead this fight is not merely that she knows these issues as well as anyone in the world today. It is that Courtney, like Senator Klobuchar, like the minister, will not ever give up until we have finished this fight on our terms, on the people's terms, on democracy's terms. Courtney.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Barry. And like Barry, I also stand here as a journalist and author and longtime press freedom advocate, both for press freedom here in the United States and abroad. And, you know, there is widespread recognition that journalism is essential to democracy, and, you know, preaching to the choir to those who are in the room and the, you know, many people we have watching online. Journalism informs society and the citizenry. It cultivates community and local engagement. And journalism, of course, holds those in power accountable. And technology has done some amazing things for journalism, for press freedom, for community engagement. I wrote my doctoral dissertation about cyber activism and citizen journalism in Egypt in an era when it was transformative. But we are not in that era anymore. Over the past decade, as we've seen innovative startups turn into monopolistic behemoths, we've seen a concurrent degradation in news media viability, with thousands of news outlets shutting down, even more journalists losing their job, and the widespread application of news deserts. And this concerning trend has been met with democratic erosion at home and around the world. Platform monopolies have damaged journalism by appropriating the role that diverse news editors used to play in influencing readers' attention and creating deep structural inequalities in the information ecosystem. The crisis facing journalism is not one of its own making. It is a result of legal regulatory frameworks that privilege tech platforms over the press and give them unfettered power to set the rules of the game, which explains why tech and news media have experienced inverse financial trajectories. It's really important that we understand how big tech platforms have come to play an infrastructural role, what Rasmus Klein calls integral and escapable role in journalism, and I would say the wider economy. In journalism, they control the audiences, where the audiences are, the engagement with audiences, publishing, content management systems, cloud and hosting storage, the tools and services that journalists use in their everyday work, from email, storage, hosting, messaging, cybersecurity, the app stores where newspapers and other businesses sell their product. But unlike the preferential treatment given to newspapers by the mail system in the 1800s, app platforms like Google and Apple take upwards of 30% of a fee, and all of the user data that is so valuable in this economy. This is compounded by a lack of interoperability and inability to have data portability, which means that if you want to change platforms, you're really constrained because it's not easy to move your users or your followers, et cetera. It has large costs to do so. And of course, they monopolize the infrastructure of the digital advertising ecosystem, what we call ad tech. They monopolize the entire digital advertising ecosystem, from ad servers to exchanges to auctions. And not only do they monopolize the digital advertising market, they set the rules. They sell the products and they shape the economy in ways that have helped fuel the increasing consolidation of our economy and the decline of local businesses that supported journalism of all types, from mainstream publications to specialty, informational, professional, identity-based and focused publications. And now they are once again redefining the economy with no input from us, the people, through the deployment of generative AI without a legal regulatory framework to shape what we as a democracy want for our political economy, what we have said we want for our country, much less the world. Big tech monopolies are infrastructural to news media, yet unlike the information communication technologies of prior eras, today's tech platforms enjoy unprecedented exemptions from libel law and anti-discrimination requirements and privacy protections. So today, the Center for Journalism and Liberty released a groundbreaking report that explores how, throughout history, we have dealt with new technologies by using government to structure competition in communications and media markets. It advocates for reforms that restore the traditional principles of competition policy, such as banning discrimination by making tech platforms subject to common carrier laws, and requiring structural separation between networks and dependent lines of business. Pretty common sense. Democracy, Journalism, and Monopoly, How to Fund Independent News Media in the 21st Century is available on our website and on the QR code on your programs. This report is really important because it comes amid growing awareness that some of these big tech platforms provide crucial public services. And in fact, they're integrated into the public services, as we saw with the wildfires in Canada and with Twitter and Facebook elsewhere around the world during natural disasters. The fact that tech monopolies form the backbone of the modern media system has prompted policymakers to explore ways to make platforms pay for the news they use. So these include recent efforts in Canada and Australia to level the playing field between technology platforms and news organizations through news media bargaining codes. Australia's 2021 pioneering law has really spurred this effort around the world. The U.S. Journalism, Competition, and Preservation Act, sponsored by Senator Amy Klobuchar, who will join us later, and California's version of the same. Meanwhile, competition authorities in India, in Japan, South Africa, Taiwan, and the UK are investigating whether technology platforms like Google and Facebook or Meta have engaged in anti-competitive behavior. And many more countries are considering legislation to address some of the power asymmetries in the platform-press relationship. And Canada is now the second country to pass such a law. And I'm delighted to invite the Minister of Canadian Heritage, Pascale St-Onge, to the stage. Minister Pascale St-Onge was elected as a member of parliament from Promisqua in 2021. Over the past decade, she served as Secretary General of the Président of the Fédération Nationale des Communications et de la Culture, where she worked to address the challenges facing the media, newspaper, and the cultural sector. As Minister of Canadian Heritage, St-Onge has been overseeing implementation of Bill C-18, a legal framework to establish remuneration rights for news publishers that has drawn heavy backlash from the platforms like Facebook and Google, which I hope we'll hear a little bit about. Minister, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Bonjour. Hello, everyone.
Sure.
Thank you for having me and inviting me. It's such a pleasure to be here today. And thank you for that introduction. So today I join you as Minister of Canadian Heritage, but before politics, I used to represent workers in the media sector. So in fact, it's what inspired me to run for office, because while I was at the Fédération Nationale des Communications et de la Culture, I've witnessed some of my colleagues, journalists and workers in the media sector, losing their jobs and news outlets closing their doors. And I also have witnessed the decline of fact-based information in recent years, and this is a serious concern to me, but also to all democracies. In a little over a decade, almost 500 news outlets have closed their doors across Canada. That's hundreds of journalists no longer working their local beats. Journalists do essential work to inform us, ask the tough questions, and hold those in power to account. They're a key check and balance. They are definitely a pillar of our democracy. But we also know that the media landscape is changing. There's less private investment in journalism, there's less diversity in information, and there's less accountability as well. We are now at a turning point where good quality, informative, fact-based news is at serious risk. So I'm here today because, like you, I understand this common challenge and the urgency of addressing it. Une saine démocratie n'est pas envisageable si les citoyens n'ont pas accès rapidement à des informations qui sont factuelles, qui les concernent et qui les aident à participer au débat public. Les plateformes numériques ont un rôle actif, responsable et éthique à jouer dans le développement d'un dialogue social qui est constructif. The platform's business model is not an excuse. They must contribute their fair share and support democracy. That's why we ran a national election in Canada with a commitment to challenge unregulated digital platforms to step up. We know these tech giants won't regulate themselves. Unless governments step in, they won't support citizens' access to news and information to protect democracy. They won't tackle hate posted on their platforms. They won't fund unique cultural content that benefits the countries they profit in. They won't deal with the challenges of AI, and they won't be ethical just for the sake of it. The public interest is our job as government. We have a responsibility to put forward solutions, and in Canada, we have. The status quo is not an option. We cannot keep going down this path and hope for proactive self-regulation that would tackle the issues that we're all here to discuss. We need strong government action, and that is what we are starting to see around the world. Australia led the way with its own legislation and later the News Media Bargaining Code, a mandatory bargaining model with a code of conduct. In Canada, we just put forward a bill, the Online News Act, which passed in June. Right now, we're in a consultation process on our proposed regulation, and what we're providing is a reasonable, responsible, and fair framework for both news businesses and tech giants. Basically, we're asking them to pay their fair share for news they use, no more, no less. The system we put forward brings tech giants and news agencies to the table together to work it out. It's not us, the government, negotiating or choosing. It's them negotiating what's fair between them. News organizations, big and small, should be compensated for the work they do, period. The independent system is run by a third-party regulator and encourages commercial deals between news organizations and tech giants, with final arbitration only if needed. It benefits the platforms and it benefits Canadians. It's a win-win solution. It is about recognizing the value of the news content that Facebook is aggregating, benefiting from in terms of user trust, user data, credibility, all while profiting many billions in Canada. Until we put into action the final regulations and the act comes into effect, at latest by December, we're listening to everyone involved. That includes the big tech platforms. I had constructive discussions with Google and perhaps less constructive discussions with Facebook. As you might know, Meta or Facebook is blocking news on its platform in Canada. That's how they've chosen to tell us what they think of being regulated. They've taken away the news during one of the worst wildfire seasons on record as people flew their homes up north. It had a real impact on people's lives. It made it harder to get accurate facts during this emergency. Basically, they're trying to intimidate us. This all raises some questions. Why are Facebook really blocking news in Canada? Why have they made their platform worse for Canadians? Why have they broken the trust they had with their users? Why turn off the Facebook News tab in European countries and reduce news seen here on Facebook in the US? Without fact-based news, have they just opened the space to misinformation and disinformation? Is their space now less safe an investment for their advertisers? Is their approach reasonable? Is it responsible? Is it acceptable that they attack countries who regulate them when it's clear that they won't regulate themselves? And should G7 governments accept tech giants avoiding our laws, which ultimately hurts our democracies? This behavior from tech giants such as Meta shows that what is at stake here is our capacity as governments to stand up and adopt legislation to deal with the challenges our countries face. The outcome will certainly have an impact on future efforts to put technology in the service of the greater good. We must all stand united against this kind of intimidation tactic, especially as more countries consider and put in place market-based solutions to resolve these issues in the digital news marketplace. New Zealand's parliament is currently considering a fair digital news bargaining bill that is modeled after the Australian and the Canadian approaches. The United Kingdom is looking at digital markets, competition and consumers bill, which would increase online consumer protections and address abuse of power by tech giants. France has also adopted legislation that uses a similar final offer arbitration mechanism to hold tech platforms to account. And what perhaps is most worrying to tech giants, we're all here today. Here in the United States, the Journalism Competition and Protection Act, which Senator Klobuchar has brought forward, cleared the Senate Judiciary Committee also in June. And it has bipartisan support. If this bill passed, Meta has threatened to remove News for You on Facebook and Instagram, just like they did in Canada and in Australia. They'll likely call it a link tax. And I'm here to tell you that they've said that all over the world, and it's not true. De plus en plus de pays prennent des mesures concrètes pour protéger leurs médias et préserver des sociétés démocratiques saines. Ils se tournent vers nous pour savoir comment s'y prendre. C'est une bonne chose parce que la coopération mondiale est la clé d'une régulation réussie des plateformes numériques mondiales. The world is watching and is starting to act. Senator Klobuchar's recent call for Canada to stand strong in the face of pressure was heartening, and I'm so pleased to be here with her today. Today, we're talking about the road ahead for financially independent and sustainable news media. Legislation to address the market imbalance between digital platforms and news outlets is only one part of the solution. The issues facing news medias are complex, and the Online News Act was never meant to be a silver bullet for all the challenges facing the Canadian news industry. We also support journalism through other programs. I'd be happy to tell you more about it some other time. But this support is helping news organizations keep innovating, and they have to keep innovating and producing also high quality news. The news matters so much in rural and remote communities. It matters for diverse communities, Indigenous communities, official language minority communities, and 2S LGBTQI+ communities. These stories need to be told and told well. We need to take a robust approach to tackle the headwinds facing the struggling news landscape. More than anything, we need to stand strong together. Facebook may be trying to intimidate Canada, but really they're trying to talk to the world. They see bills like those in the US Senate, in California, around the world. They see the US, Canada, and 25 other countries sign on a declaration recently about big tech and preserving access to news. They don't want to be regulated, period. They don't want to pay their fair share or be reasonable for what's happening due to their platform. They are shaping and curating the online environment for us. They are making decisions for us, and that's not the way our countries or our democracies work. Canadians are known for being nice, but our parliament overwhelmingly voted for the Online News Act. Canadians expect tech giants to pay their fair share and to support reliable news. They continue to refuse, but we're not being unreasonable, we're being responsible. Canada won't be pushed around. Canada will continue to stand strong, and I know that we can stand stronger together. Thank you. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you. And you can have the first copy of the report. Thank you very much. Thank you so much, Minister St-Onge. I love the fact that you pointed out how journalists are essential workers, as we see during crises like the wildfires, as well as, of course, the COVID-19 pandemic. You talked about the importance of us standing together. And so I think we couldn't agree more, which is why we're here to discuss the road ahead for financially independent and sustainable news media. And I'd like to invite our first panel to come up and take their seats. To moderate this conversation, we are joined by Edward Angueso, the finance editor at Law. Yes, please come up. Oh. Panelists, yes. So we will be moderating with Edward Angueso, the finance editor at Logic Magazine and host of This Machine Kills podcast, which focuses on the political economy of technology. Thank you, and over to you, Edward.
All right. Thanks everybody for coming. Here today with Sanjukta Paul, the professor of law at University of Michigan Law School. Emil Wan, who's Director General at Digital and Creative Marketplace Frameworks in Canada, and with Regina Brown Wilson, who's Executive Director of California Black Media. We're here to talk about how we can create an independent, sustainable media. So I think maybe the first question is thinking of, is directed, I guess, at Regina, thinking about, what are some of the imbalances that you're concerned about between big tech and journalism, that you're hoping some of these bargaining codes, JCPA, but also California's AB 88 are trying to ameliorate, and if you think that if you think that there are also steps that we can take to go. Sorry, little jet lag.
No, it's totally okay. I get what you're saying, and I think you put me on the spot, so you put me first. I like to always listen to what other people are going to say first. But just to our previous speaker, thank you so much. I thought Canadians were nice, are super nice too, and you're like ready for a fight, so I love that. I will say, because of what I do with the Black press in California, this is not a new fight for Black press in America, just in general. The work that we have done and people who've come before me have done, there's always been a fight. This has kind of created a different, where we are with big tech has created obviously just another big Goliath. So it's David and Goliath type of situation. And I was talking to some of my colleagues earlier, really kind of looking at how government stepped in to kind of create this. I was in college whenever all that happened. So I always say, who was at the wheel whenever we allowed Section 230 to kind of come into place? No one ever thought to say, wow, man, this may have some unintended consequences. So I think that there are laws in place that have created that imbalance. I think that there will have to be government intervention that will have to help fix that imbalance. But over the past 12 years that I've been leading California Black media, I have, racked my brain about how do you just fix the infrastructure problems and issues that we have. And, one of the things that I continue to come back to, at least for one stream of dollars, is I kind of look at public notice, making sure that public notice actually happens. So that's government intervention, but it's also very local. I don't think that you can ever allow it to be solely online, because then you'd just be giving all your money to Google and Facebook. It needs to be intended and targeted for the communities that they serve, or where those services or opportunities happen. And I think that there's going to need to be a multi-level approach. I think that 886 in California is going to be one of those approaches. And in California, we've had the luxury of an additional year to try to sort through and bring everybody to the table, even the tech companies, bringing everybody to the table to try to understand what we need to do. But as the minister said, some of them want to play nice and some of them don't. And I think that we have a legislature in California that is bold. It will take really strong action. And I do believe that with the leadership of Assemblymember Buffy Wicks, I do believe that something will get done. But I think there's going to take a multiple approach to get us there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I wanted to ask you, Sanjukta, about some of the antitrust approaches that we can take on. I think that a lot of the bargaining codes seem to be focused on how can we ensure that the dominance of these advertiser markets and enjoyed by Google and Facebook, we can wrest some of those funds and give them to journalists. But are there also additional interventions you think that might need to happen in the advertiser markets and ad tech markets themselves, or in any other parts of the infrastructure?
Yeah, so let me try to address this from an antitrust perspective. And I want to, I think, first put this in a little bit of a historical context. We've heard the Sherman Act mentioned a couple times this morning as well. When I was walking over here this morning from my hotel, I was excited to pass the historic headquarters or landmark of the National Grange, which was a farmers organization that was among, within the Farmer Labor Coalition that actually pushed for the Sherman Act back in the 1880s, and leading up to the legislation in 1890. It's very, very clear if you look at the history that it's a farmer labor coalition that pushed for antitrust law. So from the beginning, the reason I'm bringing that up, the Grange was a cooperative farmers organization. It was about bringing together smaller players in cooperation to deal with, increasingly the railroads, dairy processors, agricultural food processors, the tech platforms of their day, if you will, that were emerging. And there was never any contradiction between creating healthy competition and having appropriate forms of cooperation in the law. Legislators were very clear about this. If you look at the legislative record, they were extremely clear that this is something that they advocated. We went down a different path in the courts. Thereafter, Congress reaffirmed its commitment to this type of cooperation among smaller players, both in general, but specifically when bargaining with larger counterparties. In the Clayton Act of 1914, again, during the New Deal era with the Fisheries Act and, of course, the Wagner Act, are a very important labor statute. And I want to note the resonance of some of these issues that we're currently talking about in the writer's strike that just settled in Hollywood, also dealing with getting paid for your work, which is not just a fairness issue, but a sustainability issue, that this work can continue, because work cannot continue if people aren't getting paid for it, right? So I wanted to give a little bit of that context about the history, happy to talk about it further. I also want to say a little bit about the idea of competition that I think is appropriate to this statutory framework. And that I think that this example particularly kind of dramatizes. So if you, and I'm addressing myself here a little bit to, both we sort of, I think, recognize that measures like this are necessary to create healthy competition. On the other side, we hear Google and Facebook bandy about terms like news media cartel. And so I want to address that very directly. There is, let me try to simplify this. I think sometimes in the discussions that we hear from economists and lawyers particularly on the big tech side, we discuss competition as if it's just a one-dimensional matter. There's more competition or there's less. In our antitrust tradition, and I would say also in the antitrust tradition of Australia and New Zealand, I'm a little more familiar with. I wasn't as familiar with Canada, but I'm very excited to hear more about it. There was very much an idea of competition always being channeled in particular directions. Brandeis, the kind of standard bearer of antitrust during the progressive era, very much had this conception of competition. It wasn't just more or less competition. It was, what are we competing over? Are we competing over socially beneficial things like producing good journalism, or over manipulating the Google algorithm, or worse, right? And so this idea of channeled competition and then fair and sustainable competition, I think, is incredibly important. And also the recognition that competition is always, I can't emphasize this enough because we don't hear it enough, it's always accompanied by economic coordination mechanisms or by market governance mechanisms. And right now, the market governance mechanism we have is that big tech controls the entire ecosystem. So that is a market governance mechanism that we have chosen. right? We could choose a different one. This one would have the one that, that some of this legislation that we're hearing about, including the legislation here in the US, would go some way toward creating a different market governance mechanism that has more participation for more people participating in this crucial economic activity. And I think it's ultimately far better for our society as a whole. I want to note one other thing, if I could, that as I was thinking about this last night and what I wanted, I've written about this topic before. I think the first time actually speaking about it, and I realized something as I was sort of formulating what I wanted to say about this news media cartel idea, which is, a cartel is supposed to displace competition. Actually, what's the competition being displaced if we create the mechanism for cooperation here? What is remarkable about the ecosystem here under consideration is actually that there is no contract, bilateral agreement, or bilateral transaction between the supposed counterparties at all. Let me break that down. In a labor contract or an agricultural contract, at least, even when there's really unilateral control by a dominant counterparty, at least there is some bilateral relationship or contract. There's some nominal place where someone can say, well, there was a meeting of the minds and they made a contract. We know it's often nonsense, but at least you can say there was, right? Here, where is that? It's Google just unilaterally scraping content and doing what it wants to do. There is no marketplace where anyone is meeting and discussing any terms or even signing off on any terms. So there is no competition to displace here. The term cartel is completely inapposite, and we shouldn't even entertain it. And that's before we get to issues like monopsony power, on the side of Google and Facebook. It just doesn't make sense. In fact, on the contrary, having this mechanism, this market governance mechanism, which is really what it is, actually spurs competition and bargaining by, first of all, bringing Google and Facebook to the table so that there then is a discussion, there is an exchange of information. All of the traditional justifications for free market competition actually only come into being if we permit this. Secondly, as I sort of alluded to with the channeled competition idea, now we can potentially channel competition into more productive activities, such as actually having the ability to invest in good journalism. And now we can have, competition between journalism outlets on that. Moreover, as we heard from Courtney, the sort of great overview of the political economy of this sector. Of course, there's been a decline in newsroom jobs, as most of you know, as a result of sort of precisely this feature of the political economy. That means a decline in competition. If we have fewer market participants, there's less competition. So actually, incentivizing more journalistic outlets and more journalists means that we're going to have more healthy rivalry.
One question I have, especially coming out of the last section there, is how much of some of the reforms and the path ahead do you anticipate carve out a space for solutions where we're not looking to bring in more market competition or more market dynamics? Are there reforms where we're coming in, intervening, and either saying this firm or that firm doesn't have a role to play in it, or that we're going to step in and force funds to be set aside for it, or that we're going to cleave off an ad unit or access to this part of the ad market from these firms? Is that a fair reform or a fair place to look for next? First step.
So, I mean, I'm really speaking to this mainly from an antitrust and competition policy perspective. But that said, I think I would push maybe a little bit on the terms of market solution versus non-market solution, because I think one thing we see when we kind of understand, again, the idea of markets and competition that really inheres in our antitrust tradition already, it's been forgotten a little bit, but it wasn't just Brandeis, it was a lot of the institutionalist economists. There's a whole sort of way of doing rigorous economic and legal research in this tradition, that we can draw upon. In that tradition, I don't think we need to have such a rigid distinction between public and private solutions. So, of course, I think that there is a role for, I mean, what you're describing, I think saying certain types of ads are just off limits or, absolutely should be on the table. I think it's what, I may bring in a little more history, a New Deal economist who I think had a very similar idea of competition to Brandeis, Gardner Means, he referred to canalizing rules, which I think is a really good concept. He said competition is always canalized. It's always put into these canals, and they can be sort of productive canals, or they can be canals that just like rush down to the ocean with a bunch of sewage, right? And so we choose. There's always market design involved. There's no such thing as a pure free market, of course. So we have to make these choices responsibly. And so, yes, choosing canalizing rules that will direct competition in ways that we together as a society decide is what we want to do democratically is absolutely should be on the table.
Mm-hmm. Now, Amy, I know that you've worked, closely as a civil servant with efforts in Canada to, bring together these bargaining codes, and with the online news bill. I was hoping that maybe you could walk us through some of the thoughts and motivations going into Canada's attempts to, rein in or look at restructuring the relationship between some of these big tech firms and local media.
Well, yeah, absolutely. And I think the starting point of setting the table, so I think that's the kind of language that my colleagues use here. So the idea of setting the table for parties to come and actually have a place to engage in those bilateral discussions, I think is a lot of what the ultimate solution or the ultimate approach that was adopted. But to go back a little bit, I think that the news in Canada, or the news industry in Canada, has faced the same challenges everywhere else. I mean, in many other parts in the world. And I would kind of categorize them when it comes to from a financial sustainability perspective into three pillars of like financial sustainability that were all undercut with the rise of the digital platforms. So there's the advertising element, right? So that the ad buy moved to those platforms, and since 2008 in Canada, approximately 75% of advertising that was going to newspapers and news outlets shifted to the platform. So the vast majority of it. The second one, which is actually probably the more, I would say, one of the most difficult ones to really think of how to intervene, is actually a societal change that was driven by the platform. So moving from this expectation where people felt it was reasonable to pay for news, to buy newspapers, to subscribe, to the new expectation that information is free and I can get it for free and there's no need to pay for it. So that kind of shift in thinking of the people in Canada around the world was driven, of course, by the rise of platforms, and that's another big factor for news outlets that relied on subscriptions to fund themselves. And then the third one, which is just a little bit about the way we consume information, is that newspapers for a long time, or news outlets, relied on cross-subsidization. So we could pay for civic function journalism and invest in that because we were also providing entertainment and sports and other things that maybe people were more interested in, and they get it all together and we pay for it all together. And again, the platforms allowed for segregation of those different types of products. So altogether, this was like a really significant blow for the news industry. And this started, I would say, probably started to see it in 2008. By the time came 2016, parliamentarians were talking about it. There was hearings about, sustainability and the crisis of the news sector. And the government decided to act first by trying to offer support. So some emergency supports were offered to the news sector. There was a journalism tax credit that was introduced so that, there was a certain portion of salaries of journalists that could be recovered through the tax system. There was a digital subscription tax credit that was introduced to allow subscribers to get a little bit of tax benefit from subscribing to news outlets. And then a fund was also set up to help provide support for journalist salaries in local areas, so in areas that might be news deserts or remote areas. And I think those interventions were useful, but they weren't enough. And it was very clear it wasn't enough. And then in the years following that, there was COVID, which accelerated all the factors I just described. So things got even more difficult, right? So in that period of time, those initiatives were no longer enough. And by the time 2020 came along, the government was already talking about a structural change. And that's when they made the commitment to find a way to more fairly distribute or more fairly share the revenues from digital platforms with news outlets. A consultation was done with a large number of stakeholders in the sector, including from kind of the different diverse groups that might benefit from this, to identify a model to move forward. So the two models that were put out for consultation, one was essentially a fund that would be created that platforms would be required to pay in. And the second one was to create a mandatory bargaining framework. There was a lot of positive feedback for the mandatory bargaining framework, and that's the choice the government ultimately made, and that led to the Online News Act. In terms of the legislation itself, it's a pretty simple approach. So it's designed to incentivize deals. So if you're one of these dominant platforms and that's designated or that's identified through the legislation, then you have a pathway to be exempt from participating in mandatory bargaining if you meet certain conditions. And if you don't, well, then eligible news organizations can bring you, can force you to bargain. And if you can't reach an agreement, then there's a final offer arbitration as a backstop. The regime, though, is really meant to incentivize the voluntary agreements. And so in that way, it's very similar to what was put forward in Australia, with, I think, a few important tweaks. So I think one of the important tweaks is related to transparency. One of the challenges in the regime, for the regime in Australia and other places, is that if the deals are completely private and you don't know what's happening, it's difficult to see if the public policy objectives are achieved. So by creating an independent regulator that goes through kind of a public process to grant the exemptions, there's that opportunity to have, to have that independent body look and ensure that the objectives are being reached before an exemption is granted, and also to put some safeguards in there for independence of the press, right? So one of the problems with agreements that were already in place, even before this legislation moved forward, is that we didn't know what the terms of those agreements were. We didn't know to what degree the platforms were not only exercising their financial power to kind of control the terms of the deal, but that they were controlling terms specifically related to the independence of the press. We didn't know to what extent they were including, for example, different, maybe kind of less powerful news outlets, indigenous outlets, et cetera, in their agreements. So by creating conditions of exemption that require participation from different groups, that put some basic kind of ground rules in terms of the type of power that the platforms can exercise, the hope is that you would have deals that not only meet the sustainability requirements in terms of investing in news, but they do it in a way that kind of aligns with the public policy objectives we had set out. So this piece of legislation is now law. Since June, it's been law. The legislative process was, I would say, it was contentious in some times, especially when it came to the platforms. I think from the very beginning, Meta was saying, we don't want to participate. We don't intend on participating. And by the time the legislation passed, Google had also essentially made a similar statement publicly that they felt that they might need to withdraw news unless something was adjusted in the plan. And Google had, during the legislative process, conducted some tests in Canada where about 4% of users in Canada for a certain period of time were no longer receiving news. And this was, I think it was meant, they said that this was an internal test for them to kind of assess, but I think it was also a pressure tactic on the government, of course, to kind of show them this is the kind of impact that could occur if we were to remove news from Google search results. We're now in a situation where Facebook has essentially tried or is trying to block all news in Canada. And we're also in the middle of a regulatory process where we're trying to address the concerns of news publishers, indigenous outlets, and digital platforms to ensure that the regulations kind of reach the right balance. And there's been some impacts. I think for the most part, news publishers have been holding strong. Like they understand the importance of having a framework around this. And even though I think there are negative consequences from Meta's actions, they are seeing the big picture and the potential long-term benefit. And Canadians are more and more aware of this, right? So this is for a bill that deals with news, which might not otherwise be particularly of broad interest. There's a high degree of knowledge about the bill, and some support right now, like a fair bit of support as well, more than you might expect given the context.
So then, when we're also talking about then the road ahead, next steps seem to me that we have to figure out a way. It also to constrain the ability of these large firms of Google or Facebook to translate their enormous profits and economic power and distortion of their markets into the ability to restructure the laws around their operation. are we in a position to, move past the initial bargaining codes and then start trying to rein in these tech firms, or are these discussions that are also happening in conjunction with the news bargaining codes, or is that another contentious campaign that has to happen next?
The way I see it is that there's a certain progression in terms of issues. I think the way, for example, that Meta has responded to the news bargaining codes in Canada is probably a step towards signaling, or at least kind of communicating to people more broadly that there is a problem here, right? So if there's anybody that was saying there's no problem here, I don't know what you're talking about, the tech platforms have too much power, they provide great services, what's the issue? Well, this is really bringing the issue to the forefront. And I think that, combined with potential international cooperation, may well be setting the table for future ways to address these kind of broader imbalances that come with the broad range of services and the number of eyes they have. In Canada, for next steps, I mean, like, are some of the lessons that you've learned in the time since the bill was passed also aligned with this as well? I mean, like, what are the discussions looking like in the aftermath of passing the bill in terms of what the next steps might look like? So even though the bill has passed, it's not yet in force. We're in a bit of an intermediate period now where we're refining governor and council regulations that will determine to which platforms the bill applies, as well as the details of how to seek an exemption. So this is I guess a more formal kind of regulatory period. So that at this time, I don't think there's that much information about what comes next. Once those details are in place, it'll become clearer who's going to participate, and perhaps at that time there'll be more kind of discussion of what comes afterwards.
Can I ask a question? Is there, like, so in labor law, there's sort of a set of subjects of bargaining that are set out and defined. Is there something like that in this bill that says, like, what can be bargained over, or?
So that's interesting. I mean, definitely that was a kind of a decision point when the bill was being drafted, and the decision was to leave it open.
Okay.
So to leave it open so that they can the bargaining is for the making available of news, but in terms of the details of what could be bargained over, it does not specify that.
So I think thank you. That speaks to, I mean, I think some of what you're raising about, so, can we move beyond just these bargaining codes to other legislation? And of course, there's, I think, a really important value for the public as a whole to speak through legislation. Here in the US, they get legislation passed. I think one thing we should remember is the ability to sort of use this type of social bargaining to also enact some of these rules, even if they don't have quite the same sticking power as a law. So that occurs in the labor context, and so based on what you're saying, I feel like that could occur here as well. There could be it wouldn't be legislation, but rules governing behavior that could come out of this bargaining process as well.
Absolutely. And there's some that are already specified in the law. So things around journalistic independence, around fairness of the agreements and so forth. So there's some kind of criteria already set out in the law. And the idea was to have it open so that additional rules could be incorporated through the process.
If we also wanted to, open it up for Q&A if anybody has questions.
Okay, if you have a question, just hand your index card over here. Maybe you want to just get one more small round.
I wanted to kind of get back to this question of avoiding, like you said, the hard boundary between non-market and market solutions, or private and public solutions. I mean, do you see that also partly because we have room to explore different sorts of reforms, or that we are still in a very early stage of kind of getting a sense of what it is we actually want from reforms of the industry and of big tech's role in it beyond these ad revenue sharing agreements?
That for me.
Yeah.
Well, I guess I think it's broader than that. I think it's a broader view I have about sort of how we should think about economic governance. I think we should sort of get past thinking about, I mean, there's a role for thinking about the distinction between public and private, but I think it's massively overused. I think that we have markets, that we both, if we were to nationalize everything, there would still be competition. There would still be questions about governance. They would just be transferred to inside the government instead of outside the government. If we have everything as a market, we still have governance institutions that we're making public choices about, and often pretending we're not making public choices about, but we are making public and legal choices about. So I guess while there's some place for the distinction, I just think we should sort of get past it and talk about what we actually want to do. So I think there's practical questions. So if there are rules for conduct that come out of this bargaining process, I agree there's practical questions about sort of what would be I don't know, in Canada, what would be the staying force of that rule or not. And so we should focus on that, but I think a little bit less on just a question of private. But also there's a role for, I don't know if this is partly what you were adverting to before too, that if there's a sort of a more direct, like sort of public financing role for shoring up certain parts of the press, whether it's underrepresented groups, whether it's potentially the labor press, a really important institution in our country's history. And so, that should all be on the table.
Yeah. Yes.
Do we have a question, Karina?
Yes, we do actually. Oh,
No, Karina, go ahead.
sure. We have a question for Regina. How can government stop big tech from spreading disinformation and hateful content? And do you support any efforts that other countries have taken to stop it?
Wait, repeat that question one more time.
Sure. How can government stop big tech from spreading disinformation and hateful content? And do you support any efforts that other countries have taken to stop it?
Well, have we really stopped it? I don't know that. I don't know that it's been stopped. I don't know that, how does government stop it? I think that they've tried to intervene. I think we saw this with COVID and the pandemic. I think we saw a lot of things. I think we saw a lot of things whenever Elon Musk took over Twitter, and government being intertwined in what was what was able to be put out and what wasn't able to be put out. I'm very careful at trying to make sure that government is not the arbiter of that, of what I guess maybe people are saying is the truth, so to speak. But I think that people have said this already earlier today, that the press has to be free and independent. And I think that trying to figure out how to get government to stop tech companies, it goes back to Section 230. They have the ability. They're just like, hey, I could throw a rock, right? But I get to hide my hands behind my back. They don't have to actually do what news publications, what they are charged with doing. I can't go put something out and say something that's false. I will get sued, right? They have that protection that we don't have. And I feel like government has to step in some kind of way in terms of leveling the playing field. And I think that's why we're all here today, looking at what that's going to look like. But I don't know. I hope I answered that question.
Sure.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
If I have a follow-on.
Actually, I have a specific question for you, Professor Poole. Go ahead.
Yeah. Just a real quick follow-on to that. Something you said made me think about potentially another answer to your question about what are other solutions we should look at, maybe public-private hybrid or whatever. And you mentioned Musk and Twitter. So I'm just going to articulate this. You can disagree with me if there's corporate law scholars in the audience, but I think that this is something we should consider. So with the Musk takeover of Twitter, if you look at how that happened, I think it's important to consider how there are background corporate law facts that help that bring that about. Because the board, right? Remember when we were talking about sort of like actually the board compelling him to, right? Initially, the board wasn't interested, but once there was an offer, right? There was actually talk of them bringing litigation to force him to go through with it, and he was getting cold feet. But that itself, we don't know, of course, exactly what happened in the boardroom, but there's a very strong case to be made that was strongly influenced by the fact that corporate boards currently feel a lot of pressure to do something that in corporate law is called shareholder wealth maximization. It's something that's in the cases. There's other views, Leo Strine, probably the most famous corporate law scholar in the country and former judge in Delaware, has said, we've seen the destructive effects of this. We need to, understand that business enterprises are governed for the going concern, for customers, for workers, for society. Its shareholders are part of that, but they're not all of that. And as we've seen a move in corporate law toward shareholder wealth maximization, and I want to make this very clear, I'm not talking about just something that boards and executives are doing. I'm talking about the law putting its thumb on the scale, actually compelling in many cases. We're so used to kind of, I think, saying corporate executives are the bad guys, and oftentimes they are, but sometimes they're also compelled, or at least strongly canalized, influenced to go in certain directions. And we have to take responsibility for that. There is, that would just be another sort of clear potential simple intervention that there's a lot of authority and interest in already making that change. And probably a lot of boards and executives would be very relieved if they don't have to constantly think about short-term shareholder wealth maximization. And I think there's a strong argument that the Twitter board felt that once he had made that offer that was going to make shareholders a bunch of money, that if they didn't force it and they didn't accept it or even litigate for it, that they would face shareholder lawsuits. I guarantee you that they would have, right, if they hadn't done that. So just another, I think, legal change we can make that could change the market ecosystem pretty dramatically.
Actually, is it on? I do have another question here that's very interesting from the audience, and I think this could apply to everybody here in the panel. What would it look like ideally if the platforms come to the table with the news industry?
Well, I think that, and I'll just say this, I mean, it's always better. I tell my kids oftentimes whenever they're fighting over something, I have a 10 and a 13-year-old. And when they were younger, they would fight over a toy. And what I would do is, if you can't figure it out, I take everything away and nobody gets anything. And so I think that it's always best if they could come together, because I think that we could really work to solve the problem. It's not like they're not making a whole bunch of free money. I really believe that there's like 5 people working for Google, Facebook, or whatever. I don't believe that there's, for the amount of money that they make, I don't believe that there's a ton of people technically working there. I mean, I know there are, but it feels like that because you don't get the good customer service. But the reality is, I think that if they did come to the table, I would actually prefer it, because in places like California, even if we do get 886 pass through, depending on what it looks like, there's always this fear around we have propositions, we take things to the people. And so I would hate for them to overturn it. We go through all this work and then try to overturn it. I would hope, I say this, Google, Facebook, or Meta, or whoever's listening, I would say I would hope that you would come to the table, because I think that we could. I think there is a win-win.
Sorry, no, we don't have mics for the audience. Go ahead.
So maybe I could, sorry. So I was going to say that I think that, like, if this works, right? So you're going to have this additional kind of reliable source of revenues for news media, and that's going to see more news media, more journalism, like a kind of a virtuous cycle that will be created, like if those agreements get put in place, and that will address, I think, at least some of kind of the immediate needs of the kind of journalism industry, if you want to call that, in countries where they have these agreements in place. So there's definitely a significant plus side. It will not, however, solve all the problems, right? Like these issues, and I think from the opening speeches and other things that have been said so far, are broader than just the imbalance between news media and the platforms. There's things about the broad kind of range of services and areas or industries that are controlled by kind of single companies and single platforms. This is not going to solve that, right? So it doesn't solve the whole problem, but it does at least address kind of the immediate concerns of the news media industry, and has a potential to create a really positive virtuous cycle by pumping that additional money into kind of news organizations that need it.
We have one last question. At what point, if any, do intimidation tactics from Facebook or Meta go beyond being unreasonable and result in illegality? Any
Fair
views on
question.
that?
Okay, so I want to, I mean, as a starting point, we need to understand why situation, for example, with Meta right now is problematic. The reality is that Meta has built up this large user base over many years by serving news to them. So it's not like this is a business that was, Facebook, for example, was a business created around only having family members communicating with each other. It's a business that's used kind of free content or content available from news organizations over many years to build up their dominant market position. So now when they come to remove news, it's not like they've just decided to change a business line. It is something a little bit more serious. In terms of what the consequences are, I can't speak to that right now. So maybe somebody else wants to fire some speculation. I can't do.
Well, thank you very much. That's the questions we have.
That's it, yeah. Thanks for the conversation.
Thank you so much.
All right, well, thank you so much for that. Before we invite the panelists to go back to their seat, we are delighted to be joined virtually by California State Assembly Buffy Wicks. As you heard, California is once again leading the charge to impose public interest focused regulations on the tech companies that call the state home. And so we're now going to hear from Assembly Buffy Wicks, who wanted to join the conversation so much but couldn't be here in person, so she sent a brief video remarks. She authored in March 2023 and introduced AB 886, the California Journalism and Preservation Act, which has garnered widespread support and is currently scheduled for a vote in the California legislature for 2024. Let's hear from her now.
Hi, everyone. I'm Buffy Wicks, California State Assembly member and author of Assembly Bill 886, the California Journalism Preservation Act. This bill and this issue are a top priority of mine because I truly believe that a free and diverse press is the backbone of a healthy and vibrant democracy. Access to information, local news is key for our communities to have a sense of connection to one another, and it's essential that we invest in policy solutions that will help ensure the sustainability of local journalism. By some estimates, as much as 85% of the news eventually picked up by the national news organizations originates with local and state newspapers, which employ around 31,000 journalists, which is 60% less than in 2005. We have spent too much time ignoring that our news ecosystem has radically changed in ways that prevent our local newsrooms to grow not only free, but also financially independent from the pressures of those that journalists should hold accountable. Today, the power imbalance between big tech corporations and journalists and publishers has grown so big that has left the news industry at the mercy of giant platforms that control everything from publishing to audience to digital advertising to access to the cloud infrastructure and computational power needed to conduct data-intensive and investigative journalism. News media bargaining codes can provide a stronger foundation for journalists to be fairly compensated and for newsrooms to thrive more sustainably. News is not free to produce. And if we don't fairly compensate journalism organizations, it will have a profound impact on the health of our democracy at the local and state levels. That's why I am pushing so hard on my bill, which will level the playing field for journalists performing this critical work by directing big tech companies to pay publishers a journalism usage fee each time they repurpose local news content. The funds will support journalists directly because news publishers will be required to invest 70% of the profits from the usage fee into the creation of journalism jobs. Driving more digital ad revenue to local outlets and requiring investments in journalism jobs will produce a more stable news ecosystem, especially in smaller and ethnic communities. More than 100 newspapers have shuttered over the past decade in California alone, and we must do all we can to invest in solutions that disrupt this troubling trend. With AB 886, that begins with big tech paying their fair share for the content from which they've long benefited. I thank the Center for Journalism and Liberty at the Open Markets Institute for organizing this important event at this critical juncture for media and for bringing policy solutions to the forefront of the discussion for the sake of journalists, their communities, and the very fabric of our democracy.
And we thank Assemblymember Wicks for introducing such important legislation. And I would like to thank Minister St-Onge, as well as our amazing panelists, Regina, Amy, Sanjukta, and Edward. and invite you all to take a 15-minute coffee break. For our guests joining us online, please come back in 15 minutes and we will resume this important discussion. Thank you.
of threats, and the most vulnerable end up losing.
We will be aiming at demilitarization and denazification of Ukraine.
It is so powerful, this bunker of information, that he really thinks that Ukrainians are neo-Nazis. So this is a laughable statement.
We're living in a moment now where search engines have replaced things like investigative journalism. And yet investigative journalists have a high standard of professional ethics and codes of conduct by which they work in doing their work to just provide information to the public so that we can make decisions, policy decisions, and other kinds of decisions. If you subvert the possibility for democratic news media that we need to inform the public and turn it all over to advertising companies, you really change the nature of a society. And this to me is incredibly dangerous.
The result is that our democracy is hanging by a thread, and our whole system of government is in danger.
And we're seeing a general trending of authoritarianism around the world. The power that a demagogue has to mold people's opinions is exponentially increased, right? At the same time as our ability to analyze what people are saying and distance ourselves and detach and go, is what that president's saying actually really true or not? We don't have that distance anymore because we're so immersed in these worlds. So you put that together with the misinformation that they produce on Facebook, that's a very potent brew.
Great. So let me invite our panel up to the stage, please. That is certainly a chilling description of some of the challenges. And as my colleague Phil Longman wrote in Democracy, Journalism, and Monopoly, when combined with its destructive effects on the business model for independent journalism, our monopolized and degraded information environment poses the gravest threat to the world's democracies since the Second World War. So we're going to talk a little bit about that today with our distinguished panel. You have their bios in your agenda and online. And before we get into that, I want us to also address not just the dynamics of the past, of the social media era, which really saw the evisceration of the business model to sustain independent journalism, but now we're entering into the generative AI era. So if we're talking about the monopolized and degraded information environment, it seems like that may be getting even worse. So I'm really delighted to be joined here today by John Schluss, who is the president of the News Guild and serves on the executive board of the Communication Workers of America, by Rachel Oswald, CQ Roll Call's foreign affairs reporter and chairperson of the National Press Club's Press Freedom Committee, where we've worked for a long time together. Suzanne Nossel, who is the chief executive officer at PEN America, which she joined in 2013. And she has been a leading voice on freedom of expression issues in the US and globally, and author of Dare to Speak, Defending Free Speech for All. And we've done several press freedom missions together over the years. And we are also joined by Julianne Doe, who is co-director of Ethnic Media Services, a California-based news organization that supports the financial sustainability of ethnic media. So we have a lot to delve into today, but I might just start with Suzanne, who, you're the president of PEN America's really important advocacy organization for writers and authors of all types, including journalists. And you have been on the forefront of these issues, including the outrage of censorship by social media platforms, whether we're talking about Facebook in Canada, maybe soon Google search, content moderation, and the exclusion of marginalized and lesser heard voices. So you talk about the importance of getting the balance between corporate and government control of speech right. So why don't you kick us off, and how do we think about that balance, especially to ensure a free and independent press in democracies?
Yeah, well, thank you so much, Courtney, and for putting together this event and including me. As I sort of think about this interplay of social media platforms and internet platforms, the news and democracy, I'd say there are kind of four areas that are central in my mind, although they're not the only places of intersection. Obviously, we've talked about, I know this morning, the local news crisis, which is something that PEN America has been documenting since 2018. And our efforts in that area really grew out of our membership across the country. When after Trump was elected, we were concerned about press freedom here in Washington and his threats on the news media. But when we turned to our members across the country, that seemed very far away. And what was very immediate was that their newspapers and media outlets were drying up and dying out. So we did a big study called Losing the News, looking at that issue as a crisis for democracy, looking at the crisis of accountability, the lack of reporting on state houses, on issues in the public interest. And we kind of came to the reluctant conclusion, in a sense. I mean, we recognized journalism as a public good, and came to the reluctant conclusion that government action was going to be necessary to shore up the sector, which is not something that a free expression organization kind of comes to easily. But we've seen that conclusion reinforced in so many different ways in the policymaking process, in your reports at the Open Market Institute. Second piece is the unmooring of trust in information. And I think about sort of all of us information consumers in three categories. Those of us who are anchored, those who are adrift, and those who are marooned. Where if you're anchored, you sort of know where to turn for trusted information. You have your sources. You go to, whether it's the CDC or the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal. You believe that you can find credible reporting. Those who are adrift, for them, kind of everything is of a piece. And whether it comes, with the imprimatur of a 200-year-old news brand, or it's a site that, they've never heard of before, there's not much distinction. Then there are the marooned. And those are people who, they know what they trust. They know their go-to sources, but those sources are grounded in disinformation. And, the reason I call them marooned is that they've become so hard, so out of reach. So in that, the other two pieces in the film covered this polarization, distrust in institutions, sort of shaking the foundations of our democracy. And then the last is online harassment and vitriol and the ways in which that affects journalism and civic discourse. The challenge with all of this is, in many ways, intensified government regulation could make it worse. And we're seeing, these laws, for example, in Florida and Texas, that would completely strip away the social media companies' leeway to moderate content, which I think is the wrong answer. But you can see how the intrusion of politics and a sense of grievance and bias in the platforms is sort of fueling that regulatory impulse. So I do think we need to be very careful. We tend to talk about regulation. I feel like in our heads, we imagine some combination of, Ruth Bader Ginsburg and Thurgood Marshall and maybe, JFK coming up with these perfect rules. That's not who it's going to be. It's going to be, the likes of a Donald Trump or a Ron DeSantis. They're going to be part of that puzzle. And I think that's why we need to proceed cautiously. I think we're fortunate in a way, I think, now to see the Digital Service Act in the European Union beginning to take hold, because I wrote in a piece in the Wall Street Journal at the beginning of the year that I really see no alternative to trial and error. I think we've just got to move ahead. We've got to experiment. Nobody really knows. No one knew these consequences would ensue from social media. No one can be entirely sure of the consequences of regulation. I'm kind of glad that experiment is being launched. And I know that it is having an impact. It's, some of the areas they've focused on, including data access, auditing, policy transparency. They're things that are really putting the companies through their paces and forcing them to become more thoughtful, more diligent, more deliberate, more self-aware. And that's positive. And we may learn that some of those models are ones that we can adopt here, and we'll get there ideally without sort of having to compromise the First Amendment, for something that we don't, that is unproven, where we don't know whether it will work. And then I guess finally, two observations about AI, since you brought that up. The one is somewhat hopeful, which is, in the arena of content moderation, the constant tension is between the inability to apply subtle distinctions. between, what should be protected expression and what is harmful content that should be taken down. And to do that at scale is just virtually impossible. And I do think AI potentially will help with things like that. For example, something like a newsworthiness allowance, where content that would otherwise be considered hate speech can be left on the platform. Today, that newsworthiness allowance is like a manual process. A human being has to sort of weigh up, is this newsworthy? Is it being kind of shared for that reason? Or is it just the spread of hate? I think with AI, we'll be able to make those distinctions at scale. There's at least the potential that we'll be able to make those distinctions at scale more easily. With that said, I have to say, in terms of the undermining of truth and trust in our society, I am deeply worried about the ramifications of AI, because I think about today just how difficult it is to break through with anything that really seems authentic, and how much doubt has been sowed for all of us about what it is that we hear and read. And I think in an AI infused world, everything kind of by definition is derivative. And the power of the technology lies in the ability to put something forward that seems as if you've written it, you've said it, you've thought it, you've invented it, when you haven't. And I think when we all get used to a world where that kind of content is just coursing through, and instead of being 15% of our inbox as it is today, with sort of spammy emails, it becomes maybe 80%, and we don't know what is what. So, I think a hopeful note and a very cautionary note.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think as we kind of make this transition to generative AI, the ability to identify quality information and have a supply of good information, which is essentially journalism, is going to become even more important, especially if you think about communities that are traditionally marginalized or not represented in the mainstream media. And so, Julian, as the co-director of the Ethnic Media Services in California, how do we look at the tech platform media relationship in a way that enables us to build a more inclusive, participatory democracy, and the role that journalism plays in that, especially journalism that serves specific communities? And I would just ask, what are the challenges facing specifically ethnic news media in the digital age? Advertising, engaging audiences, the generative AI revolution. Maybe talk about some of what you're facing.
Great, thank you. I feel kind of awkward and ironic to be on a panel under the theme of democracies, free market, liberties, that's at peril in America, because these are the values and the principles that have drawn millions of immigrants coming to America looking for these principles. And here, if it's failed here, then where do you go from here? So ethnic media sector is not a monolithic. So we have Asian medias, Middle Eastern, Native American, the Black press, and many other groups. So each group is really different and from different experiences. But I would say that by and large, a lot of ethnic press representing the immigrants communities, they come to the US looking for these principles. So immediately, as soon as they're here, they create their own medias and trying to assist their fellow citizens to have ways to adjust to the new societies, to be engaged in the new societies. And that's about signing up for driver license, get a job, pay taxes, and also go to vote with all these things. So they have been instrumental in terms of getting people to become part of the American fabrics and embracing all these values here. And at the same time, they realize that it has to be more than that. So they look to the Black press as a model, because if it wasn't for the Black communities break through on the civil rights, then you would have, so all the things in the constitutions, but are they really in practice? So we decided to embrace the principle of the Black press. So that's how the ethnic press coming together to promote and to embrace the principle of democracies. The challenges we face are so manifold. Just like the mainstream press, we were sold with the premise that if you open up your content, if you post a content on the platform for free, then you will get exponential audiences, you will get more money, and so on. And what we look at over the 2 decades is that the platform revenue generation is like this, and then the media content producers is going like this. So it really doesn't make sense. And then even when they try to have their content posted and play with the rule that's set by Meta and Google, what they get is like $50 a month. And then when you try to question them, I've done all of this, and this is all I get. And then they would say like, well, you might want to put more efforts into having your audiences and even pay for the boosting of your content. So they a number of our members did that. And then what they're seeing is that the more you invest in the platform, you're actually getting your money less. So it really doesn't make sense. So it really is provide many challenges in the ethnic media sectors, and we feel that the more we engage with the big platforms, the less we learn, the less opaque it is, because they would never provide you with the data, with the information of how they actually calculate and generate. Why at the same time to be like enough information.
Yes, I think you hit the nail on the head. We lack the information to even establish the value of news on these platforms. And I think that we see efforts by the platforms to narrow this concept of the value of news to, the revenue generated by click-throughs, right? Referral traffic. But you could pull back and say, news provides a lot of value just by its presence on these platforms, which is what a study in Switzerland did, and found that actually if you take news out of Google search results, people change their behavior and go elsewhere for news. They go to other platforms, they go directly to publishers. And so we should really be rethinking how we consider the value of news. John, you are both a longtime journalist and president of the News Guild, CWA, and you represent the people who create the news, right? We don't have journalism to save if we don't have journalists who have jobs, who are able to go out and report the news safely and freely and independent, which is something that I've thought about a lot recently. Also, as we look at how much the the platforms, specifically Google and Meta, are funding specific news outlets, journalism training, and potentially co-opting, the journalism community that needs to cover them. So how can we think about the linkages between the conditions that journalism is working under, that journalists are working under, the existence of journalists, and platform power, and how do we need to reorient this?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good broad question. I think overall the industry struggles because we've lost so many human beings, right? Like in about a decade, we've lost 40,000 print newspaper journalist employees. Overall, it's like 30,000 when you account for the additions from digital online publications, which aren't filling the gap. So we're losing a ton of actual human beings who typically are a lot of veteran journalists who know how to do things really well. Like when I was at the LA Times, I benefited a lot by sitting next to someone who could hound, someone in the county office to get that public record. And that helped me learn how to then be an aggressive asshole back to that person, right? When it was my turn to get that public record. And we're losing those veteran journalists as they are fed up with the overall lack of job security by, changing management. And then kind of on the back end, you've got the ability to, kind of build your platform and your personal presence, right? So a lot of journalists have been told and instructed by their employers to get on Twitter, to get on Facebook. I was part of that 15, 20 years ago, whenever the hell that started up, feels like ages ago, to build your own platform and build your own audience. But then, you're basically providing your free labor to Elon Musk, right? To Mark Zuckerberg on Facebook. When you try and actually put, the work of crafting a headline to provide a Twitter thread on these social media platforms. You're providing it as free labor in another direct way to the platform. So it's complicated because a lot of journalists, struggle. I mean, we represent folks at the New York Times, the Washington Post. Those are folks that are in a bit better standing at the Wall Street Journal. But there's a lot of small town journalists who, have to go to a food bank to be able to feed their family, or have to sell their platelets to actually get more income, or, drive for Uber or Lyft in addition to doing their job, which makes it a struggle because they deeply care, because people don't really get in journalism for the money, right? We get in it because we actually care about telling the story of our community. So it's all kind of wrapped up into kind of a vicious cycle where you've got not enough help supporting the actual journalists to stay in their job, and a lot of market forces there. And then on top of that, you've got Google and Facebook basically siphoning away a ton of talent and all of that free labor we're providing.
But I mean, can't we just replace all the journalists with AI?
Yeah, sure. That'll go really well. As we've seen, with Microsoft calling a dead basketball player useless, in the generative AI story, which of course the AI was like, well, the person died, so they were useless, right? But it was awful. It's just not the way that a human would do it. So to me,
not only that, I mean, you're talking about the journalists, people who are selling their platelets to fund their ability to do their job, but their job involves going down to the courtroom, sitting in, hearings. What do journalists do in the community, and why does that matter for democracy?
Well, they have the connections, and they're doing the shoe leather journalism of actually collecting the facts, right? That's very specific work. We're sitting down, we're taking notes about what you're saying live, or what you're saying just to me in a one-on-one conversation after we've, developed a relationship maybe over years. So developing those facts and then trying to actually interpret that through I always ground myself back into our journalism ethics, right? And so our principal ethic as journalists is to seek truth and report it. Well, generative AI is just built on an algorithm of previously written sentences and word choices, right? It's not the development of finding out new information, seeking that truth, and then reporting it out. So it's principally flawed. I do think that journalists should actually be free to use it, and I think workers need to be in control and empowered to use artificial intelligence. They have already done that for years in a lot of different newsrooms, using machine learning to actually develop and enhance their investigative reporting. But it shouldn't be used in a dark way, like on Google, for instance. I mean, Google's already doing this in their search results. They are not even providing the links. They're just using generative AI to say, when you type in a question on their search engine, to just provide that relevant information based on news that they are already scraping in violation, I would point out, to the terms and services of almost every single website on the internet.
That's a perfect, yes.
If I can chime on that point, is that AI thus far has been very detrimental to the ethnic communities, because they have been used for manipulation to produce a lot of misinformation, a lot of disinformation. And we've seen that throughout the pandemic of how they will prey on very specific communities and knowing the biases in the communities. And it's been the work of the ethnic press in trying to combat that misinformation. And so AI been used for a lot of interpretations, but so far, it's been more harmful to the ethnic communities. And then that is something that I think we have to be careful. And I like to echo what Suzanne said earlier, is that one of the reasons that many immigrants come to America is that they want to be free from government interventions. They would like to have free press. And because they've seen that, all that oppression, all that censorship back home. And when you hear, and then when they hear about the government might try to regulate all these things, they become very skeptical.
Yes, absolutely. And, not only are ethnic media having to deal with the misinformation, but essentially they're then subsidizing these platforms. And I would say, platforms are turning journalists into the janitors of the internet, because we have to clean up all the crap that's on the social media platforms without compensation. But to add to that, the destruction that I mentioned earlier in the report that we wrote, seems to be amplified by the rapid advances in generative AI, again, without legal regulatory frameworks. And this risks further reinforcing the tech monopolies, the power asymmetries that have made it so difficult for the news industry to figure out financially viable models. And compounding the loss of ad revenue is the theft of their intellectual property. In fact, news media are among the top 3 most important sources of information for training models, yet they're facing an existential economic crisis, siphoning, these platforms are siphoning off valuable content. And, Rachel, as a reporter for CQ, which has, the kind of traditional journalistic approach, but also some paid products, you are both a reporter, you have to navigate this platform power, but also CQ has to work with the platforms, right? And journalists have to cover the platform. So can you talk about some of these tensions and why addressing these power asymmetries are so critical?
Sure. So my company, CQ Roll Call, we have a public facing part of our company, which is Roll Call, which puts journalism up for free to anybody in the public can go to Roll Call and read it. And then the CQ part, which is the part I primarily write for, is a subscriber website, and it tends to be it's expensive. So a subscription is something that is purchased by like an embassy, a local embassy, or a lawmaker office, or the Pentagon is a big subscriber. So that's our revenue model, and it has provided some, but like not complete total insulation from the complete cratering of the advertising base. Roll Call does not have the reporters that it used to have, I will say. Roll Call used to have more reporters. CQ now is kind of the main revenue generator. The company that owns CQ Roll Call, Fiscal Note, they purchased CQ Roll Call in 2018. They have made the strategic decision to collaborate with Google, with Microsoft, with ChatGPT. They believe that in return for allowing those big companies access to something like 2 decades worth of publicly available reporting on Roll Call, primarily covering Capitol Hill, covering legislation, covering the big political figures of the day. In return, they get to innovate their own proprietary AI algorithms, which benefit the subscribers who, CQ Roll Call, Fiscal Note, they have massive data sets, not just of the US government, but of the states, of municipalities, European Union member states, major Asian democracies. And so they are using their insights into how generative AI works to kind of improve and get like a market edge about how they can use their AI algorithms to enable their clients to better use the data that they get as a subscriber. So that is a decision that my parent company made. They felt like 20 years of Roll Call reporting that we give out for free isn't going to harm the business model. I know that other news companies, I know the Associated Press has been resisting strongly the scraping of their own massive amounts of journalism by these AI companies. So I think it's going to be different companies are going to make a different judgment call on that, and that's C-suite stuff. But for me, as a reporter,
I feel like the journalists need to be involved in that discussion, right? That's the challenge.
I mean, I have no objection to what you said. But I will say, on my level, I don't think that we have, covering Facebook, covering Google, that's all fair play. That's all completely fair play in the newsroom. We have never been told to like pull our punches and stuff. And one of my coworkers, Gopal, he's our technology reporter. He has been very aggressively covering the debate on Capitol Hill about how to regulate the social media companies, how to approach AI. So we haven't found that. But I can say, and I am, even speaking from my position of like relative privilege, where my news company still has a viable revenue model. Times are hard. They are hard. There aren't enough reporters. There's not enough time to delve into the stories the way we want. I mean, we're scrambling. We don't have as many reporters in the newsroom as we used to, and that is because of financial reasons, and
I know we're lucky to have you here because you go every day to the Hill to cover what's happening. This is not something that a chatbot can do, right?
And I have a question for you, Rachel, just to understand how it's working. So is it that the company's decided they're going to allow all of roll calls archived to be sort of scraped into the models, and in return, they're getting access to some proprietary algorithmic AI that can allow them to monetize other data sets that they have? Is it like a bargain of sorts?
I really can't speak in depth to that. I just know what, I just know the kind of the talking points that the company has disseminated, that they agreed to allow them to have access to a couple decades of reporting on roll call. In return from this collaboration, they feel that they are able to get ahead of our competitors in working on their own AI plugins.
And this is something that we've also seen the Financial Times, Associated Press. We're seeing some of the large companies creating these deals. And I want to pull back a little bit because this emphasizes one of the issues in this whole debate, which is transparency. How much transparency should we have into the deals between private companies with the platforms, not only on the AI side, but on these news media bargaining codes? So like in Australia, none of the terms of the deals are public. In Canada, they'll be provided to a regulator who will have some oversight. And I think that's a recommendation also in the JCPA. So let's talk a little bit about transparency and why that matters for holding platforms accountable, as well as for establishing the value of news. And Julian, let me ask you, how do we even figure out the value of news when we don't have data from the platforms and they have no requirement to provide that? How are you going into the negotiations in California, for example, thinking about the value of the news that ethnic media provide, for example?
We don't have specific data, but we do have qualitative proof. As an example, during the pandemic, it was clear that among the most affected population in California were actually the ethnic minorities. And who are these people? They are also the essential workers. They're the one who pick fruits, vegetable, and produce food on the table. And who are the people who are the backbone of the healthcare system? There's actually a lot of Caribbean and Filipino nurses. And so they are on the front line. So they are on the front line, risking their lives to maintain society, keep going. And yet, when it comes to testings and when it comes to vaccinations, they are the last one to get. So the ethnic press has been instrumental in terms of wearing two hats. First of all, you have to combat disinformation and misinformation. At the same time, you have to play the leadership, organizing all these things, advocating for. So it's clearly that the ethnic press has strong value in terms of reaching the audiences as well as influencing the audiences. But what about the numbers? And that everybody's talking about the numbers. So unfortunately, the number is not there. And when we play by the rule with Meta and Google, and we ask for the numbers that shows on their website, on the analytics, is actually totally different from the numbers that Google would provide. And then when we inquire about how do you come to these calculations, they always say that, well, this is our proprietary information. And so it's really something that we have proof of concept that we do have audiences and we do have influence, and yet the number is not there.
And I mean, Suzanne mentioned the EU Digital Services Act. I'm waiting to see, can we leverage that to help with this debate? I think that's very much up in the air. But, Suzanne, we talked about disinformation, misinformation a bit. One of the solutions that's being proposed to prevent, for example, large language models and these very wealthy companies, like we hear a lot about innovation in the AI space, but in fact, we know that the space is monopolized by the same big tech firms who have a little finger in everything. We're putting out a report later in the month that will have more information on that. But the idea presented is, well, just put some code on your website. And your terms of service, prevent crawling, put up paywalls, but we know chatbots, or we know that crawlers can go around and include paywall content. And if you take the supply of quality information out of the public sphere, doesn't that just make the disinformation, propaganda, misinformation situation worse?
Yeah, look, I think it's a dilemma. I think we need some kind of, something like a compulsory licensing scheme like you have in the music industry, where there's compensation back. I mean, it's interesting what you say about, CQ, and I'm curious about, if they're not seeking any revenue for this, why is that, and what do they see in terms of their own interest? The AP negotiated a fee structure for their information. That seems like more the model. But should it be kind of a universal standardized model? I think probably it's just impracticable to have anything other than that. There are obviously these lawsuits underway that authors are taking the lead on because their books have been scraped, sort of without their knowledge and against their will into these large language models. And the questions of, whether copyright applies, and we don't really have the ways of thinking about this. Something like the fair use doctrine, applies to like little snippets of content. This isn't little snippets of content. It's sort of this massive, bulk of content, but that's being, spread across and disaggregated into sentences and fragments and words. So is that some version of fair use? So, I'm glad the lawsuits are underway, because I think it'll at least lead to some careful thinking by judges and law clerks and law review writers about how to navigate these issues. But it's very kind of Wild West right now. And there's a lot at stake in how these questions are decided just, in the coming months and years. We may sort of set in place, as we did, 25 years ago for the internet, some very, a basic like Section 230 that then, becomes so foundational that it's kind of in practice unshakable.
I want to ask John a question, but also remind to please send my colleague if you have a question. We're going to be going to Q&A shortly. To your point, Suzanne, there was one data set that has 200 million copyright designations in its data set. So clearly they're using copyright material. The music industry, the radios are required to say pay a licensing fee or streaming, not to get advance, notice, and we're not going to, let you use our song catalog, right? That doesn't work. And that seems to be the discussion we're having here in journalism. So John, also as we're entering this generative AI era, how are we thinking about the platform press dynamics and the role that journalists, who are also the authors in this case, and a lot of journalists who are freelancers or who run their own, one-person news outlet, what should we be thinking about to address these power imbalances?
Well, part of it is the illegal actions by these platforms have already been done, right? Like they're violating these terms of services. They've basically scraped, not just like every AP story, the entire internet.
Right.
And let's be clear. Yeah. And every book, right?
Tens of thousands of books.
And, in the meantime, we're also setting up these digital sweatshops all across the world where they're having people look at really terrible information and making decisions about whether to classify it as this or classify it as that, right? So there's all these like moral and ethical dilemmas. And then on top of that, this scraping of everything. So to me, I think like transparency is key. Like going back to that point, like we need to know exactly what they've done, and they should be held liable for violating copyright laws, depending on where they sit, whether they're with an individual author, whether with a publisher on a book or a website or with a news company, because we have to like fight back against the idea that we're just going to continue to give our labor away for free. I think that was one of the big problems when we discovered and we happened upon the internet. And as news publishers, we were like, let's just use it all for free, right? on one way, that's like great because we need to get stories out. We have to get that truth out to as many people as possible. But then we don't think about the consequences of how that just becomes the norm. And then, things being freely available on the internet allows like companies like Google, Facebook, and OpenAI to basically scrape all that data. So again, it comes back to the transparency. And speaking about the Associated Press, we're in bargaining at the Associated Press. They've been long union at the Associated Press. They provided some scant details about this deal that they entered with OpenAI. Basically OpenAI already scraped all of their stories. So I don't really exactly fully understand the benefit. And then the AP has actually put out a series of guidelines on like making sure that journalists do not publish anything that's created through generative AI with a series of guidelines. But then the management at the AP actually refuses to agree to those same principles when the workers come forward and they say, we want to just agree to the principles that you're providing in your guidelines, that we won't just run things for free. They still want these carve-outs to do things down the road that are potentially questionable and could like open up a liability for individual journalists who are told to use artificial intelligence to do their jobs and could be held responsible individually for the AI screwing up something. And potentially have consequences like when there's one of the things the AP does, right, for every single news story internally is they also provide like a short summary of that news story, which typically is the thing that's read in broadcast. Well, some managers at the AP are basically like, well, that would be a really great way to speed up that process. We could just say, here's the story, spit out the summary. But that becomes like a really critical, concerning issue that you actually need a human journalist who's got decades of experience to be able to think about. When you're talking about like, I don't know, if a sitting senator is charged with like crimes, you got to think about how you report that fairly and accurately, right?
Right. I think that's such a great point. And you mentioned that, publishers and journalists, put their content out for free. Yes, great. And as I said earlier, this is not a problem of the news industry's own making. Just because they did that at that time, right. These weren't also the infrastructure for the advertising ecosystem and collecting all of the data. Like the telephone company is not allowed to listen into all your calls, know who you talk about, package that information and sell it to advertisers to then target you with, right? So it's a very different dynamic.
And even more insidiously, right? Like when you have like, oh, we want this Facebook share button that we put on our website, that little bit of code, right, that we did for Facebook share or Google share was basically providing the platforms a way to then turn cookies onto every single one of our users, every single one of our readers online.
Again, a lack of transparency. So I'm going to thank you for everyone who submitted a question. If you still want to write it down on your note card, and I will take those from my colleague. Thank you. So we have a question. Oh, this is a very timely, newsworthy question. Anything in the new writers agreement that's relative to this discussion? John?
Yeah, sure. So I've only seen what's like publicly reported out in terms of like the use of artificial intelligence. So one thing is that if a writer in Hollywood is provided anything from a studio, the studio is obligated to say this was, created through generative AI. So, if someone's sitting late at night and being like, come up with the next Marvel movie, whatever Marvel movie number 40, right? And then ChatGPT spits it out and they hand it to writers, they've got to acknowledge and say that this was, created through artificial intelligence. I think another big concern, and I don't know fully like how this is addressed, but is like whether or not, there's like a pushback to make sure that the studios can't provide like the content that writers create as training material for models. That's still not clear to me fully in there, but there is at least like the assertion that they do have to follow the law and follow the contract. So there's some good frameworks on that. I think there's a bigger concern with the actors right now, pushing forward to make sure that like actors can't just be brought into a room, fully scanned, have their voice recorded and their likeness used without compensation for the rest of time. That's a really huge concern for us.
That's a great concern. We also have a question from somebody from our live stream. We've talked a lot about news media and journalism, but I'm going to throw this to you, Suzanne. Can you please provide a definition of who and what is a newspaper and journalist and who should define it? And I think specifically when we get, when we're talking about some of these government policy interventions, how do we think about that?
Yeah, it's a good question, a difficult question. And, when we think about various forms of legislation that might protect journalists, you kind of walk right into this question of who is a journalist, and is it, somebody who has a press credential? Is it somebody who is from a publication that has certain, measures of professionalism, editors, fact checkers? Is it anybody who starts a website and has news at the top of it? What about, I have often thought, with cable news, like we ought to call that talk television, because it's not really news. It is just people sort of ruminating and sometimes fulminating. And so, and then you have citizen journalists, like people who, are out at a protest and they, Darnella Frazier, who takes this pivotal piece of video of the murder of George Floyd, that catalyzes a whole international movement. Should she be protected? If there was, a claim that she violated someone's privacy or infringe their rights in some other way. And so these are difficult questions that are kind of unresolved. And honestly, as PEN America, we have tried not to kind of weigh in and opine.
I see you do that in your questioning back there. I see you doing that in your questioning back, right?
Yeah, to sort of draw boundaries, because we're kind of afraid of, both who would be put in. You also get into questions of, what about these foreign government-controlled media outlets, that are Chinese or Russian? Like, do they deserve the protections that we afford to journalists? Because if they do, that has implications, say, for their visas and their access, to different settings where they can gather information. So it's a really thorny question, but it may be that to implement some of these solutions, kind of, we have to put some stake in the ground on some of these difficult dilemmas about where the boundaries lie.
To chime in on that is that we actually handle a case that one of our members, Russian language medias, when they investigated a fake charities trying to raise money for the people in Ukraine. This is before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and they were sued, and they were sued on the basis that this is not a legitimate media. And then that's when we learned that even in California, the definitions of a news outlet is based on the frequencies of publications, and it's not based on the quality or the content that you produce. And so we immediately produced a letter to support that. We have been working with this media for a long time, and they do provide quality and valuable services to their communities. And it requires so many different organizations to come around to vouch for these organizations, and they've eventually won the case. But it's for some reason, and then because of this case, I learned that actually it's never been clearly established in the US who is a journalist and which one is a news outlet. And when we work on the different bills of SB 911, even SB 886, there is still that definition that is not clear. How do you apply that to the mainstream? And then how do you apply that to the ethnic press? And when Suzanne mentioned about when some of these organizations are actually foreign-based company, but operating here. So it's get very murky, and it's totally unclear at this point.
Can I chime in? I will just say, in a previous position, I was the volunteer chairperson of the Standing Committee of Correspondence on Capitol Hill. And this was in a normal time period, and this was right after the insurrection and during the COVID pandemic, so it wasn't a normal time period. But during a normal time period, a lot of our work was reviewing applications from news organizations for accreditation on Capitol Hill. It's considered one of the most important accreditations you can get in Washington, because having it gets you accreditation at the White House, and it's just kind of like a go-to press pass. So. And we actually had to update our guidelines for news organizations that would qualify for a press pass. We looked at the foreign news outlets thing, because we were aware of the propaganda coming from Russia, from China, and we really agonized over how to get it right, about how how to. We didn't want to open ourselves up to a lawsuit, but we also felt like we needed to be specific about, independence, like editorial independence. So like looking for that. And also the other thing that we insist upon, which frequently what if we're not going, if the committee was going to deny an accreditation, it was frequently because the person applying, the news outlet applying, did not want to reveal their sources of the revenue. We say we need to know that you're a professional, independent news outlet by understanding who funds you. Now, we understand that the traditional profit model has changed, and now some nonprofit news outlets are getting money from foundations, from donors. That's fine, but you need to tell us, particularly who the big donors are. And so when news outlets didn't want to tell us who their big donors are, we would be like, okay, so we cannot determine your editorial independence. So, and you may be editorial independent, but since we can't determine it, we cannot give you the accreditation you're seeking. And so sometimes news outlets did end up telling us their funders, and sometimes they refuse. So there is a way when news organizations and professional organizations take it upon themselves to police themselves. I mean, I think I agree with you, Suzanne, in that in my press freedom work over the years, I felt like a broad definition is best. I don't want to be gatekeeping.
Right.
I know that journalism can be privileged. I don't want to let important citizen journalists who are trying to step into the void and do some of this work be left out in the dark. But if we're going to ask for a generous definition, then I think it's incumbent upon us as journalists more so than ever to self-police and to abide and uphold our codes of ethics. I think this is what separates us from people who are trying to, use journalists, for in a bad faith way. And
just to add real quick is that the Russian language media that I was talking about is independently owned, and they criticize the war so much that they are banned in Russia and blocked websites. So.
And I think so. You hit on, I think, a really important principle that we talked about earlier: transparency. We also, as the media, need to practice what we preach. We should be, I think, leading the vanguard of transparency. And I think that would really help with some of the platform press regulations. Also, unlike the platforms, which really have not self-regulated, journalism has very strong and long tradition of self-regulation, right? We have professional bodies, ethics bodies, in self-regulatory licensing bodies. And I guess I would wonder, should lawmakers be looking to those existing self-regulatory mechanisms to help define who's in and who's out of these sort of regulatory frameworks, as opposed to creating entirely new ones?
I think it's a challenge because I think that's the beauty of America's journalism spheres, right? Anybody can potentially be a journalist, whether they're an immigrant or a kid in rural South Arkansas who knows nothing about journalism, right? You can really find anyone from anywhere, which is good in that building more perspectives, right? And the idea that we're self-regulating means that, we need more and more journalists to actually help with the self-regulation to help us grow, which we're missing with the job losses. But what some things have happened, right? Working with the Society of Professional Journalists or other journalism organizations, Penn, I think, was involved in this. And we all feel very awkward when we're trying to even talk to politicians and giving them the idea that they could license who is and isn't a journalist makes me go very icky, right? But, we're in this critical moment where we have to actually provide some sort of help, right? So there are sort of definitions is this, more than one person? Do they carry media liability insurance? Are they doing a series of actions, and if it's a local journalist within a, series of a geographic area, within 100 miles of the particular area where they're working, and are they doing things like reporting, photography, videography, things like that? You can kind of define those acts. There's not a perfect way to do it, but that's been sort of an attempt.
Yeah. Another question from the audience about, the issue of billionaires owning media and buying or subsidizing media for vanity or policy reasons. And I would also, just add to that question, this issue around kind of media solidarity, right? So you've got, there was a lot of disinformation by the tech platforms about what happened in Australia with only big media benefiting, which is not accurate. Most of any small media, small publishers, they were able to collectively bargain. And pretty much anyone who wanted a deal got a deal with at least one of the platforms. Although, it looks like it's about $200 million total. a lot more went to the Murdoch press because they also are bigger outlets that get more traffic. But this issue of, we've talked about platforms in the press, we're talking about billionaires who also own those platforms and the press. So, what is the situation for independent free press in this scenario?
I mean, I'll just speak again on it. Like, we represent about 220 different news organizations, big and small. Some of them are publicly traded. Some of them are owned by families. Some of them are owned by billionaires. So like billionaires being like Jeff Bezos and the Washington Post, right? Or Patrick St-Onge and the LA Times. It's a weird world. If you go back, to the early days of the founding or the start of like the LA Times, right? There was like a rich guy who also basically controlled the Chamber of Commerce, who owned the LA Times and used the front page to basically just put out his views on how he thought Los Angeles should form in the early 1900s and late 1800s, right? So like, I think that that's like been a common thread. We're seeing fewer and fewer of those kind of people who, even if they're, hyper rich and like completely disconnected with everyone else in society, they at least like have the idea that they want to support financially this institution and, inject their opinions there. But we're seeing fewer and fewer of those groups, right? A lot of what we see, from the Chicago Tribune to the Baltimore Sun to the New York Daily News to the Allentown Morning Call are owned by hedge funds, right? And so that's one thing we haven't talked about here today, is that hedge funds and the financialization of news is also leading to the demise of the industry. If you look at Alden Global Capital, which purchased the Denver Post in 2010, since they purchased the Post, and I just looked up this figure yesterday, they've cut 83% of the staff in about 12 years, right? And that's way faster than the overall declines of the industry. So hedge fund ownership is extremely dangerous. Private equity ownership of media is really problematic. The billionaires are sort of goofy and weird and disconnected, and some of them are decent sometimes,
Right.
and some of them are less decent other times.
It makes me think, I was just paging through your new report and your conclusion that sort of the advertising model, is terrible until you consider all the alternatives. And it's sort of like the vanity ownership is terrible until you consider all the alternatives. Like, and it's sort of a sad state of affairs that we don't have, much better.
We don't have a norm
except maybe
around
the New York
citizens
Times,
for news.
the very few outlets where, they've actually, because of their scale and scope, they can create a viable business model or, a niche like CQ. But, beyond that, it's just, these outlets would not be, would be on life support if they didn't have the support of some of those billionaires. So,
but it also kind of underscores why looking at things like common carrier requirements would be so important, so that you don't have, billionaire platform owners buying up the press in order to, funnel that and shape the information environment. And, we've seen with Twitter/X, for example, actually limiting referrals and accounts of journalists and news outlets that are negatively reporting on him. How is that legal in the American system? We have free press, but it doesn't work if the people who own the press, own the pipes, own the advertising are all the same people, right? I mean, where do we go from there? I'm going to ask one more question before we wrap up this panel. And it comes from someone in the room about whether there's a prisoner dilemma in terms of adopting AI before safeguards are in place for everyone. And I think that's, something we're all grappling with, is you want the legal regulatory framework, but you feel like you have to adopt it. And Julian, let me specifically pass this to you, because we also had a question about how AI specifically is affecting ethnic news media. So what do you think? I mean, this prisoner's dilemma.
On the one hand, for small newsroom with few staff, Chat GPT and even Google Bart have the capability of generating news content and information for background for research. And also translating a lot of news into different languages. But so on the one hand, it's not really about the technology or the AI. it's how it's being used and who use that. And so far, for many ethnic communities, it's been greatly employed by the influencers who use these tools to create lots of misinformation to generate traffic that in effect they are making more money than the real news content producer themselves. And as you mentioned earlier, and then out of that, it really is the editor and publisher of many ethnic media outlets. They have to really clean up the cracks out there. So it still remains to be seen, but from this perspective, it is the more autocratic government out there who aiming to influence many of the diaspora in the US, actually using more AI than the ethnic press themselves for influencing. So this is something that the ethnic press is very concerned about, and in a way that they don't have that much of resources and tool to combat. It's so far it seems more as something harmful than beneficial.
Great. Well, I want to thank our panelists. Before we wrap up, one last final thought. What is the main message you want viewers here in the audience and online and policymakers to take home with them about how we govern this tech media platform press relationship? John?
Companies that don't include journalists and all the conversations around generative AI and how that implements and is implemented in their news organizations are going to fail at this and embarrass themselves and destroy their brand. So include your journalists in these conversations, include your journalists in actually talking about any legislation or regulatory changes.
Rachel?
I would just say to the lawmakers and regulators, journalism, independent, professional, robust journalism is essential to democracy. It really is. And I think it's essential to national security. If we are not able to do our jobs, corruption will go unnoticed. Bad deals will be done. We will be weaker as society. Polarity, and not just polarity, but distrust, toxicity, it'll increase. Yep. Like we journalists, we're saying as loudly as we can, like like our house is on fire and we don't know how much longer we can do this. And people are leaving journalism. People are leaving journalism in mass numbers. And I think they're more needed now than ever, given the many crises going on here and around the world.
Suzanne?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to add much to that other than I think it's so complicated and there's so many contested interests that there's a danger of sort of succumbing to a narrative of futility where you just feel like AI, it's inevitable, it's going to be worse than social media, and there's nothing we can do because, our Congress is paralyzed, no one understands it. It's galloping forward at such a torrid pace. And I think that's a real danger it's almost kind of what happened with social media was a sense like this is just too complicated to get your arms around. And so I think and I think I admire the work that you guys are doing because you're persevering in the face of some very, very strong headwinds. And I think we all have to do that.
And Julian?
I would say that as a fourth estate in the societies and everything is really connected. So if the free markets fail, then there's go with the ability to sustain the media. And when that disappears, then there's go liberty and democracy. And this is something that the ethnic press have seen too often in their homelands.
Too often here in the US and I think around the world. And, one of the things that really this whole debate emphasizes to me is what we do in the United States and how we govern these technology platforms and the information environment has a profound impact on the sustainability of news media in the US and around the world, right? We know that in many parts of the world, Facebook is the equivalent of the internet, right? They don't have choices that we have here, and many are working in repressive environments where there are really limited options other than a handful of dominant American tech platforms. So how we make these choices for our own media is going to send a signal around the world. And one of the things that I'm really hopeful for with the Journalist Competition and Preservation Act, Canada's Online News Act, New Zealand, Australia, like we're getting a groundswell here that hopefully will help shift the balance of power, not only between the platforms and the press and democracies, but also around the world for the media that depend on them. Thus far, you mentioned earlier, Suzanne, the European Union, the Digital Services Act, the GDPR, the Data Protection Act. They've got the Media Freedom Act being negotiated. And it does seem like we've abdicated our role in the United States for governing these platforms to the European Union, which, thankfully has stepped up to the platform. But we are lucky that we have some lawmakers who are working on this, including Senator Klobuchar, who is on her way in, potentially. Excellent. Great. So I will invite the panel. Thank you. Please join me in giving them a round of applause. And you can go ahead and take your seats. Yeah, so just, as we're waiting for Senator Klobuchar to come in, we've mentioned the EU quite a bit. So the Digital Services Act does have transparency requirements and data access requirements, which I think that we should be looking at as the news media here. How can we leverage existing frameworks to get some of the data that we need to make these value of news? And, Barry, you've been working on this a long time. We've seen, as I mentioned, this abdication of the role. Why don't you come up here so you have a mic, kind of the abdication of some of our responsibility to govern. But we've seen that Senator Klobuchar has been very active in proposing the Journalist Competition and Preservation Act, but also at getting, this breaking up these monopolies or thinking about what are the policy interventions we need to level the playing field. So, you've worked with Senator Klobuchar for a long time. Can you talk about some of the work that she's been doing that's helping further this here in the United States?
Yeah, I mean, Senator Klobuchar, we started working with Senator Klobuchar in 2017. And, there's really just been a couple of senators who have been tracking this the whole time. And Senator Klobuchar has been there from that moment on and actually developing a deeper and sharper understanding of the issues. Just really sharpening her legislation, sharpening the message. I mean, Senator Klobuchar is one of the true leaders. But in terms of, and I'll do this in my introductions also, but Senator Klobuchar has been one of the few people who has really been very sophisticated and effective working cross aisle. And, even after January 6th. So it's which is the kind of, in order to get this kind of legislation across and actually in order to get support for the agencies that we need, in order to head off attacks on the agencies that are not helpful, that could actually interfere with their ability to do their jobs. There's a whole bunch of things that, the senator has sort of mastered in a way that few other people have. I actually see Senator Klobuchar walking this direction. So I'm going to actually turn the podium over to you to start the introduction.
Great, thank you. So, as you heard, U.S. Senator Amy Klobuchar became the first woman elected to represent Minnesota in the United States Senate in 2006. So she was actually here at the beginning of the social media era. Recently, she served as ranking member of the Senate Judiciary Subcommittee on Antitrust, Competition Policy, and Consumer Rights. And in this role, she has championed the rejuvenation of American antitrust and taken on large technology corporations, and is the daughter of a former Minneapolis Star-Tribune sports writer and columnist who I heard has written more than 8,000 columns. And of course, we are so delighted to have Senator Klobuchar here as the co-sponsor of the bipartisan Journalism Competition and Preservation Act, which was introduced in the Senate in March 2023. Thank you so much. It's nice to see you again. Thank you.
So
Taiwan.
we're doing a two-part introduction here. And, I just wanted to actually say a few more personal words about Senator Klobuchar, because, 2 years ago, I had the honor of testifying before the Senate Antitrust Subcommittee. And this was just after Senator Klobuchar retook the gavel. This is March of 2021. And I had already worked with the senator for a few years and had been enormously impressed by her vision and her commitment. Yet on that day, in March 2021, in the late stages of the pandemic, Senator Klobuchar started with a very sobering statement. After more than a year on the campaign trail, crisscrossing America, Senator Klobuchar wanted her colleagues and the public to know that her thinking had changed. Monopoly, the senator said, was a much bigger threat to American democracy than she had fully realized before. The American people were much more concerned about concentrated power and control than any of the people on that subcommittee fully understood. Better yet, Senator Klobuchar made clear that she intended to do something about it and that the time had come to move from study to action. There was another message that day, equally important, and it came from what Senator Klobuchar did not say. The hearing took place barely 2 months after January 6th. Yet in that room, Senator Klobuchar treated every colleague with absolute respect, and the senator kept the focus relentlessly on the subject at hand. And since then, the senator's approach has paid off big time, and I'll just give you two quick examples. First was to get the American Innovation and Competition Online Act voted at a committee on a 16-6 vote with strong bipartisan support. And the second was to help Senator Lee take his own place among the true anti-monopolists with his America Act to break up Google. Senator Klobuchar sees, understands, educates, and leads. A century from now, when historians are tallying the heroes of this era and the great fight of democracy against monopoly, Senator Klobuchar will absolutely be recognized as one of the few great anti-monopoly leaders in American history. Thank you, Senator.
Oh.
That was really great. Thank you. You made my day. Nice to take a little break from the Hill. Good news, though, last night, the Senate did on a bipartisan basis, 77 votes, actually, would have been more. We had a few members out. Someone has COVID. My colleague, I think we would have been at 80 votes for the stopgap measure to get us through the middle of November. So now the action, I think we have a few more votes on it. It's going to get done. And then we look over to the House and we're hoping that the full harvest moon will, instead of we'll sort of give them wisdom as they look up. But it is great. I just met with the minister from Canada and had a great discussion with her about their news bill. And thank you as well, Courtney, for your leadership and your super cool shirt. Thank you, Barry, for your leadership for just years and years. Talk about ahead of your time when it comes to this. I can't even tell you how far ahead of your time that you were, as well as Rachel and John and everyone here is doing for press freedom, because that really is what is at stake in front of us. And whether it's consolidation, whether it is threats against reporters, there are a lot of things going on right now. And people can wrap themselves in the Constitution, but if you're serious about doing something about the First Amendment, that means making sure that we have strong media and strong reporters and journalism. And so that is really what motivates me, as well as my personal piece of this. As Courtney noted, my dad was a reporter and 40 years in journalism, started out as AP, called the race the Nixon-Kennedy race for Minnesota, which ended up in the New York Times because that's how the race got called nationally. And then he went on to be a sports writer, covered the Vikings in their early days, wrote a book that's sadly still relevant today called Will the Vikings Ever Win the Super Bowl? That's true. He wrote that in the early 80s. Then he ended up writing a general column about whatever he wanted. And he was someone that wrote about, in his words, ordinary people doing extraordinary things. And I still actually have a bunch of the, when I got to the Senate, people then would start sending me these yellowed columns that they'd tack up on their refrigerator with words like, "This meant a lot to my grandpa before he died. Your dad wrote about my teacher. This was about my wedding," and just regular people that he had somehow touched, and it actually informed a lot of the work that I did. And then the last piece of this, I'll read you what his own words, what he wrote. He died just a few years ago when he talked about his job as a journalist. And he said, was it worth it? Was his job worth it? And these are his words: "The dead of night plane flights, writing against the clock, absorbing the jocks screaming curses in the loser's dressing room, keeling over from the tear gas in a Miami street outside the Republican convention, trying to keep the mother of a dead Marine on the phone, although she was crying and alone in the house while I struggled with my revulsion for doing this. Was it worth it?" His answer, God, yes. So that's what the torch that I carry on here today as we look at what is happening with news. So I think we all know the numbers. You've probably been discussing them, but it's predicted that 1/3 of the US newspapers that existed 20 years ago will be gone by 2025. We're seeing similar with small radio stations and the like. We're starting to have news deserts where there's really no reporting and there's no national or chat GPT that's going to be able to figure out what's going on in a town city council or what the amendment is that someone does in the middle of the night unless there's reporting. We're not going to be able to know if a business is closing or opening, or even what happened in the high school football game on Friday night, things that actually bring people together. It's not all investigative reporting, right? It's news, joint news in your area that brings you together. So while we saw the US newspaper numbers plummeting for revenue from over 37 billion in 2008 to less than 9 billion in 2020, we saw two companies, Meta and Google, worth well over 2 trillion combined, become advertising titans. There's literally one side goes like this and their side goes like this, especially when it comes to ad dollars. I think we know that the work that has been done so far is just extraordinary, starting in Australia, where over $200 million has now, that was my last numbers, it may be updated, have now switched hands because they were willing to take this on and say you have to pay for the snippets and the content that you're showing for those that generate the stories. Canada, of course, we see this assault where the threats that were made in Australia and then they back down on are actually happening in Canada right now, not on Google's side, but on Facebook's side, where they've taken things down just simply because they want to negotiate what the right rates are, even in the midst of wildfires devastating the country. As Prime Minister Trudeau correctly called out, Facebook was putting corporate profits ahead of people's safety. So what does this mean in our country? I love giving an update to the Canadians on what's happening there. I spend a lot of time asking them and they go, how about you guys? I go, oh. So I actually see a lot going on in this area, kind of behind the scenes, as I would say things move slowly, but they are moving. They are moving in part because of what Europe is doing in competition policy as a whole, as these lawsuits wind their way through the courts, the FTC initial suit on Facebook, the Justice Department's suit on Google, and of course, these all involve attorney generals on the left and right, which is good. this bipartisan piece of this cannot be more important. When you look at success like the AT&T case that spanned Democratic and Republican administrations, some of these suits were started during under Macon Delrahim and Chairman Simon during the last administration. So I just think that's important for continuing this piece of it. Certainly important for me trying to get these bills passed. The Amazon suit filed yesterday by the FTC, I actually think that message, like I finally, it was very focused so that I could explain it to people. It did happen on kind of a high news day for other reasons. That is not their fault, but sometimes this stuff takes time to get out there. But this simple idea that for small businesses that have to really, for most of them, they have to be on Amazon, that 50% of their revenue is going to Amazon. That's something I had two of my colleagues bring up this morning to me because they heard it on the radio. So, we just need that kind of straightforward, because the people who are fighting this, and again, these are not companies that anyone wants to destroy. They are huge generators of ideas and innovation. But what we're looking at here is guardrails to make things fair. What we're looking is when they are in monopolies in certain areas, that you may have to, as happened with AT&T, divide these companies up. There's all kinds of remedies here for what's going on. But we have been stopped even from common sense regulation. Things like Chris Coons' bill to look at algorithms and letting people look at it. A federal privacy law. I'm just like, now they want that, but before they fought it for years. Doing something on the kids front. My favorite recent one is fentanyl-laced pills being advertised by cartels on the internet. We're having trouble advancing that bill. Like, seriously? These aren't my bills, so I kind of like to bring them up. So not because they're not, but everyone is having trouble is the I guess the conclusion. And then these bigger competition bills. So the Amazon suit, where it was clear about the danger to the sellers, which we always want to emphasize that, if they want to put their lowest price off of Amazon, then they're going to get punished and bullied, and they don't get the little click about buy here, with people like me who have no time. If I don't have that, I move on. Okay. Or that they're going to be buried in the site. That's pretty outrageous stuff that people can relate to. Or the danger to consumers when you see they're not getting the best prices, things like that. I just bring that up because when you look at this news bill, you cannot look at it in isolation. You have to look at the fact that these cases are going on and the ball is being moved forward. And with what's happening in Europe, these cases will eventually result in something, believe me. And out of that can come some of these provisions, even if we can't get them all passed into law at the same time. So that's kind of how I look at my work, because otherwise I don't know how I'd keep going. As my husband said to my daughter last summer, be nice to your mom this weekend. She's taking on the 4 biggest companies the world has ever known, and she just got banned from Russia. So the news bill. So I actually have a lot of hope for this, just because of the fact that Canada is moving ahead with their negotiation. And at what point can we explain why we're allowing this to continue in a country that values the First Amendment? This, of course, our solution is the bill that Senator Kennedy of Louisiana and I have. It's the bill that Ted Cruz now supports after a lengthy negotiation in my office, which resulted in me putting the word throttle in the legislation, but it's okay. We have broad support for that bill, and Senator Schumer is supportive of the bill. This time we got through the Senate Judiciary Committee on a 14-7 vote. And as we look at the AI legislation, I'm sure you've talked today about AI and the threat that presents to journalism and compensating reporters, that this actually would be helpful on the AI front to have this exemption from the antitrust laws to allow smaller news organizations to leverage their might, because there is no way that the Worthington Globe, that's in Worthington, Minnesota, where I was just there 10 days ago to judge a turkey race in a referee outfit, blocks with thousands of people yelling as a turkey ran through the crowd. It did very well, very well. It won. That Worthington Globe is not going to be able to get Mark Zuckerberg to pick up the phone. Okay. And so getting these negotiations going, and I would even like to see a faster timetable, is so key. And I see this AI legislation that is inevitably coming down the pike. I'm doing a hearing this afternoon on the election piece of it as chair of the Rules Committee. Couldn't be more important. So I think that our model is part of the solution, certainly not the only solution as we look at that. So I just think we know that we are seeing more and more consolidation across the country. The expert here on this is Barry, and we must do something about it. So I am honored to have such a great staff to work with. Dan is here, who's our Judiciary Chief Counsel. Ben, our detailee from the FTC, who took Mark's place, who's here visiting from the FTC. Mark was the longest serving detailee maybe in the history of America. How long was it, Mark? Yeah, 5.5 years. You know, there we go. At one point I was joking. It was like Mark and me and one other lawyer that was like taking on like 5,000 lawyers from the companies, but we did okay. And Ben's doing a great job. So I would love for you to give any thoughts, ideas you have to Dan and to Ben as we go forward. And I just want to end with the idea here in a really, really divided time, how important for us in this policy area. And the White House has shown great leadership in terms of who they put in these jobs and the like, but are to keep working on a bipartisan basis. That bill, even though it wasn't everything we wanted, that we were able to get through on the financing of the agencies. They were trying to delay it for 2 years, as Barry knows, and you never let a good mistake go to waste. They had used the wrong version by mistake of Mike Lee's venue bill in the budget, put it in there, and Mike sends me a text early in the morning, and it's like the Mormon version of WTF. Okay, it doesn't say that, but he's like, "How did you pull this off?" And I go, I didn't pull it off. They used the wrong version. And that helped us to then negotiate having the money come sooner. It was a 2-year delay, and Mike helped me with that, even though he wasn't on the other bill, and we did it together. By the way, that friendship was best exemplified by when we did the Ticketmaster hearing and last fall on the monopoly situation there. I got a text after the Taylor Swift debacle from Mike Lee, in which he has screenshot the text he got from his own daughter. And it said, "Dad, you know what a Swiftie I am. And Dad, if you don't do something about this, I'm calling Amy Klobuchar directly." That is a true story. So sometimes it's not just your friends across the aisle, it's their kids, like, anything you could do. So that has been my philosophy, that sometimes you stand next to people that you don't always agree with for the betterment of this country. There is a history when you go way back to the beginnings of a competition policy, which I document in my book that was on the New York Times bestseller list for 2 weeks only. But when you go back, it has always been bipartisan. And, it was Teddy Roosevelt, a Republican, Senator Sherman from Ohio was a Republican. Then you had many Democrats take up the charge as well. And it's been done this way because of this belief in open markets, giving you a little, and competition, as well as protecting consumers, sort of combined. And this idea that we talk about this, not with the word antitrust, despite the name of my book, but that we talk about it as competition policy, I think couldn't be more important. So I want to thank all of you. It's been great, and keep up the faith here, and keep up our belief in our friends across the border, because being in Minnesota, I can see Canada from my porch. So with that, thank you. Thanks, everyone. Appreciate it.
Thanks. Well, thank you, Senator Klobuchar, for those incredibly powerful remarks and a reminder of just how
much of our economy and our politics is dominated by monopolies. This is not a situation of the news media's own making. We have to have structural interventions. Our political economic system affects not only the future of democracy here, but around the world. And tech platforms have become so good at providing non-monetized and underpriced services that get people hooked and compel the market to adapt. They create a new economic system of surveillance capitalism. Thank you, Shoshana Zuboff, because they were allowed to buy up technologies and companies while freely collecting massive amounts of data. Remember DoubleClick, a deal that got virtually no oversight? That they promised the FTC, they're not going to combine data from across their services. And in fact, Google did just that a decade later. We need structural solutions to realign the size and scope of these companies so that they don't enjoy so many monopolies. And like my OMI colleague, Sally Hubbard mentioned, there are nothing else than structural interventions. And economic power translates to political power. So our choices about how to govern technology will impact power dynamics for the rest of the world. So thank you. Barry, would you like to make some final remarks? Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you, Senator Klobuchar. Exactly. When they decided the Google case, back in the day that, you can use the snippets, those were grainy images, they weren't these full-fledged snippets. It's very different. So with that, thank you to Senator Klobuchar. We'll turn it over to Barry to conclude. Thank you.
Thank you, Courtney. And I have a couple final comments, but before I do that, I actually just want to thank our team. Karina just walked out the door, but Austin and Audrey and Ezzy and Ashley and Daniel, and Phil, and Kanzada, where is Kanzada somewhere around here, and I also, once again, want to welcome Courtney to our team. I think it was pretty evident today that one of the reasons we're going to win is because we now have Courtney. And that's actually what I want to end with, which is that we will win, and we are already winning. Just yesterday, the FTC brought a sophisticated multi-front case against Amazon. Just yesterday, FCC Chair Rosenworcel began moves to restore net neutrality. Just 2 weeks ago, the DOJ began arguing its case against Google's search monopoly. Just 3 weeks ago, the European Commission, under the authority of the Digital Markets Act, designated Google, Amazon, Facebook, Microsoft, and Apple as gatekeeper corporations subject to special regulation. Not one moment too soon. The democracies of the world are building and enforcing a structure of law to make the internet safe for democracy in the 21st century. But thus far, our democracies, our enforcers have left one big piece missing, and that is the protection of the press and of our rights to communicate with one another freely and without manipulation. Some threats are bigger than others. The threats we have discussed today are the biggest of all. The time has come for the FCC, the DOJ, and the FTC to deal with Facebook's and Google's threat to the news, with Elon Musk's threat to debate, with Amazon's threat to book authors and readers. No excuse for delay. This is your job number one from this moment on. The business models of these corporations are based on the manipulation of news and information presented to the individual. It has turned them into the most awesome disinformation and democracy destruction machines ever built. The DOJ's case against Penguin Random House Simon & Schuster merger, that was a good start. Its case against the Google ad tech, Google ad tech's power, that's a great next step. But all three agencies must immediately step fully into this breach here. In 1945, as the Allied armies were battling into Berlin, Supreme Court Justice Hugo Black wrote, "A free press is a condition of a free society, and that freedom must include freedom from repression by private interests." Amen. So. Anyway, thank you guys all for coming. This is Amy Klobuchar's book. Buy it. And actually, I want to note, when you do buy it, that this cartoon on the back is by my very good friend, Peter Cooper. So